Chapter 830. This mission was a little rushed, so Lu Xiaoyi didn't waste any time. However, he met senior sister Kawa before he left the crack. Obviously, she was waiting for him here. This mission isn't the one I found for you. She was a little apologetic. Because of her special status, she knew a little about this matter. Lu Xiaoyi smiled and said, "Senior sister, don't worry. It's all the same to me. If I could choose, I would rather choose this mission. The ones who should be worried are the monks. Senior sister, do you have any Buddhist items that catch your eye? Should I snatch a few for you? Or should I snatch a beautiful little monk to relieve senior sister's boredom?" Kawa scolded. A dog's mouth really can't spit out ivory. Seeing Lu Xiaoyi disappear into the crack, Kawa felt a sense of loss. She also wanted to go, but the sect didn't allow it. When the time came, a small battle between cultivators would break out in Shaking Shadow Little Land. Bitter Zen Temple versus Sword Vein Alliance. The various Taoist sects would strictly control their Jindan group and obtain the Buddhist sect's promise that the battle would be limited to the Jindan realm. No matter who won or lost, they would have to accept the result of this battle. In the eyes of the higher-ups, the cultivation world was a kind of art of compromise. The Buddhist sect occupied Shaking Shadow with their own abilities, while the Taoist sect wanted to cause trouble. This was the truth. Considering that the Taoist sect was strong and the Buddhist sect was weak, and considering that the Buddhist sect was in the right and the Taoist sect was in the wrong, this awkward situation was formed. The various Taoist sects could unconditionally support the Sword Vein Alliance in terms of resources, information, and transportation, but they had to be careful when it came to sending out people. Shaking Shadow Little Land was one of the countless bridgeheads that blocked the Buddhist sect's expansion, but it wasn't the only one. Regardless of whether it was the Taoist sect or the Buddhist sect, they didn't want to expand the battle for Shaking Shadow Little Land. It was a large-scale conflict led by the Yuanying and carried out by the Jindan. However, it was limited to this and didn't involve the true monarchs outside the universe. Therefore, the various Taoist sects could only send their best swordsmen, such as Single-Eared from the Free and Unfettered Tour. What made Kawa depressed was that this guy would always encounter the most turbulent incidents in the domain. In other words, trouble was always following him. His life was tense and exciting, but for someone as diligent as her. Cultivators should grow in adversity. This could stimulate a person's greatest potential. But you can't look for trouble. For someone of Kawa's background, even if she wanted to be in adversity, it was not an easy thing to do. In Shaga, she almost succeeded in putting herself in danger, but in the end, this guy came out. She also wanted to immerse herself in such a grand and vigorous activity, but unfortunately, others didn't bring her along to play. Wait a minute. Kawa suddenly realized something. This guy never did anything without a purpose. Why was he in such a hurry to return to the Seven Colors? Did he really miss the mountains and rivers there? She didn't believe that a murderous person who had just joined the Carefree Guild would understand the meaning of love mountains and rivers. He must have a motive. What was it? Carefully recalling this guy's tracks, and based on their interactions in the past few days, Kawa realized something. Red Mount, Chamber of Commerce, 7 Colors. Kawa pursed her lips into a smile. Finally, I caught your tail. Lu Xiaoyi ran through the cracks in the space, and his heart was filled with emotions. His original purpose was not to do this. There were 2 reasons for coming to 7 Colors. First, he had to come. Even if he didn't do anything and didn't come into contact with anyone, he had to make a kind of decorative disguise for his identity. He had to make some specious things to deal with any possible interrogation. For a cultivator who came from the 7 Color Sword sect and had cultivated in the sect for hundreds of years, to really be able to ignore his homeland, this was not normal. Second, Yuanying said that the Red Earth Chamber of Commerce might come to 7 Colors to cause trouble. This was also his purpose. He wanted to attack these uninvited guests and then take the opportunity to kill his way back to Red Mount. With his current strength, he didn't have to worry too much about the so-called unorthodox Yuanying. He had to find out who the one who attacked him in Yanhai was. Then, he would go to them and take back Ju City. The plan was well thought out, but once it was carried out, it immediately went awry and became embroiled in the feud between the sword vein and the Buddhists. He didn't dislike this, but he had to be careful. How should he handle the relationship with the Seven Colors Sword sect? Also, regarding the Red Earth Chamber of Commerce, he could only postpone it for now. As soon as he came out of the crack, two Jindan sword cultivators came to greet him. Right now, the Seven Colors Alliance was also a gathering place. Rogue sword cultivators from the surrounding small continents had been gathering here in an endless stream. Of course, there were also many who wanted to fish in troubled waters, so he had to be extra careful. Lu Xiaoyi didn't stop. He nodded in greeting, and the sword intent on his body expanded and retracted, indicating his purpose for coming. The two Seven Colors swordsmen cupped their fists in return. Needless to say, there was no need to doubt their purpose for coming here at this time. They were all waiting for a group fight. The sword vein seemed to have an inexplicable magical power. No matter which universe or world they were in, because of the sword, their temperament was always the same. It was one of the most cohesive orthodoxies in the universe. If a big power wanted to dig at the roots of the sword vein, it was inevitable that help would come from all directions. Of course, there were also many big Taoist sects adding fuel to the fire. According to the overall plan, after the swordsmen near the Seven Color Sword sect gathered, they would all take the Cloud Sea flying ship to the yawning Shadowland. They couldn't use the crack because the Bitter Zen Temple had already closed the crack teleportation portal to the yawning Shadowland. Without hesitation, he went straight to the Seven Colors Mountain where the Seven Colors Sword Vein was located. The Seven Colors Mountain of the Seven Colors Sword sect in the Seven Colors Small Land. This name was very lazy. In fact, on this land, the most famous thing was the Seven Colors Mountain. Because the mountain was tall and steep, different geological and ecological environments gave the mountain different colors. The lowest part was mineral brown, the highest part was snow white, and the middle part was either lush green or red leaves. Hence, the name Seven Colors was well-deserved. He needed to join the Seven Colors Swordsman's team to have the qualifications to board the Cloud Sea flying ship. Otherwise, it would be too time-consuming to find it himself. At the same time, his arrival could also express the attitude of the Xiao Yaoyu. The first time he used the mask, he felt that there was no feeling at all. It was like a layer of activated skin. He could do whatever he wanted. He made himself look like the swordsman he killed in the land of exile. To a cultivator's memory, there was no problem at all. The use of the mask was not limited to this. It could also confuse a cultivator's breath, defend against mental attacks, and even block a part of the mysterious. There was one thing that Kawa was right about. This small, inconspicuous object was the peak embodiment of the Xiao Yaoyu's ability to make equipment. It was not only made to change the appearance. However, Lu Xiaoyi was very clear that no matter how well this thing imitated, it would never be able to replace the real one. No one was a fool. Chapter 831. Lu Xiaoyi nodded to the two Foundation establishment swordsmen at the entrance of the Seven Color Mountain. Lead the way. The Foundation establishment disciple obviously did not recognize him as a member of the sect from decades ago. He only thought that he was another swordsman who came to help and hurriedly led the way. Lu Xiaoyi did not inquire further. It was a last-minute effort, and it would not be appropriate no matter what, so it was better not to do so. Soon, they arrived in front of an unnamed hall. The Foundation establishment cultivator respectfully said, "Marshal Uncle Huang is in charge of receiving us." "Shangxin, just go in." Lu Xiaoyi strode in. A Jindan sword cultivator in the hall revealed a look of surprise when he saw Lu Xiaoyi. He was a little suspicious, but it was also very real. He was not too sure. But Senior Marshal Brother Sean? Lu Xiaoyi sat down boldly. "That's right. How should I address you, fellow Taoist?" Junior Marshal Brother Huang was a little dumbfounded. How could this be? He had only left for less than 100 years. How could he not recognize the Senior Marshal Brother that he had spent so much time with? "I'm Huang Zhen. Senior Marshal Brother Sean doesn't remember me? Ever since Senior Marshal Brother was summoned, there's been no news of you." Later, there was news that Senior Marshal Brother had died outside, but the lantern in the mountain gate was not extinguished. Thus, I knew that senior martial brother had gone somewhere else. It was not good to ask, so I destroyed the lantern and pretended not to know. But what happened to senior martial brother? Once you return, you don't even recognize your old friends? Lu Xiaoyi was Dafa. I'm single-eared. I'm from the seven-colored mountain. There's no mistake about this. But I don't recognize any of the people and scenery of the seven-colored mountain. I haven't lost my memories. Do you understand, Junior Martial Brother Huang? Junior Martial Brother Huang did not fully understand. The only thing he could do now was to immediately inform the senior Jin Dan in the sect. In the seven-color sword sect, they had a supreme, but he spent most of his time roaming the universe and never meddled in the affairs of the domain. His attitude was exactly the same as the few Yuanying swordsmen in the sect. It was not that they really did not care, but their status did not allow them to meddle. If they really took action, who would be able to resist the hundreds of Buddhas and hundreds of Bodhisattvas in the Bitter Zen temple? Only people at the level of Jin Dan could be responsible for it. This kind of propriety was very clear to the small businesses. Not long after, 5 Jin Dan swordsmen arrived on their swords. Because of Junior Brother Huang's warning, they were very calm. Among them, Jin Dan, the leader, was very polite. I am Gao Yang, the representative of the Sharpening Sword Hall. This is Zhong Qian, the head of the sect, Bo Lu Yuan, the guardian of the sword, Guan Mingyue, the elder, Qizishan. May I ask, Lu Xiaoyi still said the same thing. It's the first time we've met. How fortunate. I was ordered by Xiao Yao to help you. I only have one ear. Your junior brother only has one ear. The few Jin Dan men were all experienced Old Dawn. Once they heard his words, they understood. This was a swordsman from Xiao Yaoyu. He was using the name of one ear to participate in the battle. This was an old trick used by the Jin Dan men. It was to cover one's ears and steal a bell for the sake of the so-called rules. Gao Yu said cautiously, "Thank you, fellow Taoist, for coming from afar. We of the Seven Colors welcome you with open arms. However, there's something I don't know if it's appropriate to ask. Is my junior brother doing well in Xiao Yaoyu?" Lu Xiaoyi evaded the question. I am your junior brother. This is the truth. I'm not here to participate in the decision-making. I'm purely here to fight. Inform me when you board the boat. If you need me, I'll be in charge of the deployment. After he finished speaking, he didn't wait for their reply. He walked out of the hall and found a random place to sit cross-legged and adjust his breathing. His behavior made the few swordsmen of the Seven Colors slightly dissatisfied. However, they couldn't say anything. He was an inner sect disciple. He had high aspirations and was very arrogant. Although he didn't answer the question, it was good that he said he wouldn't interfere in the decision-making. Zhong Qian shook his head. This is great. A master Xiao Yao has come. You and I have to serve him well. I wonder how junior brother One Ear is doing? Gao Yu sighed. This is the rule of the 9 great sects. Those who leave are like spilled water. It's also the rule that he doesn't answer. If he does, what can we do? Well, since he said so, we'll just pretend that he's One Ear. Xiao Yaoyu is very cautious. He even pretended to be One Ear. Sword Guardian Guan Mingyue was the only female cultivator among them. She had to be more careful. It might not be on purpose. Maybe this person is Xiao Yaoyu? When everyone heard this, they felt that it made sense. Elder Qi Zishan laughed and said, I was wondering why Xiao Yaoyu was so stingy this time. They have a few sword cultivators under them, but they only sent one person over for this occasion. If it's Xiao Yaoyu, then it makes sense. Zhong Qian snorted. Let's hope he lives up to his name. Of course, the core strength of the upper sects doesn't need to be mentioned. However, I don't believe that he can surpass us in terms of swordsmanship. Maybe he's just a swordsman. He's still a Dharma cultivator at his core. Gao Yu decided, that's right. He's still a helper. He's One Ear, and One Ear is him. Don't talk about whether it's real or fake. It's meaningless. You have to remember that you have to solve your own problems. It's unrealistic to expect help from others. The Tao sect's Dharma branches added fuel to the fire this time, but they did it for their own sake. They don't see the sword vein as family. We're in the sword vein for our own orthodoxy. It doesn't matter if there's help or not. We have to do what needs to be done. We'll wait for 3 more days and arrange the defense of 7 Colors Mountain. We'll set off immediately. Lu Xiaoyi found a random place and silently observed the swordsman orthodoxy. 7 Colors left a good impression on him. It had the valiant charm of a swordsman, which made him feel a sense of approval. Over the next few days, there were also individual swordsmen from other continents who gathered here. They didn't come here for a reward, and no one would give them a reward. They just felt that as members of the orthodoxy, they should step forward bravely. This was a battle that neither side tried to hide. The Bitter Zen Temple didn't seem to care about the gathering of swordsman sections. It could be that they wanted to make an example out of the swordsman sects, or it could be that they were pressured by the other upper sects. The Bitter Zen Temple was one of the stronger sects among the 9 great mountain sects. Even the carefree wandering sect had 5,000 Jin dance sects, so the Bitter Zen Temple had even more. Excluding those who couldn't be mobilized, those who were restrained, and those who couldn't be contacted, it wasn't difficult to gather 1,000 or 2,000. However, it was hard to say how many Sword Vein could gather. Along the way, he glanced around. The scale of the 7 Color Sword sect was also very limited. This was also the helplessness of the unorthodox sections. How many cultivators could they raise in such a small place? Although he wasn't too sure about the overall strength of the Upper Realm Sword Vein Alliance in Zhou, the key to a group fight was cooperation. On this point, the Sword Vein was naturally at a disadvantage. In addition, there were also the problems of command, coordination, and fighting on their own. This was a big scene. It was the first time for him to fight with thousands of people. Although the 5th ring was a den of bandits, they had good control in this aspect. This kind of fight wasn't very useful for accumulating battle experience, but it would cause a huge loss to the core Jin dance sects of the cultivation world. The gains didn't make up for the losses. He didn't know how much he could do in this, but he did his best. Chapter 832. On the 3rd day, the sound of sword whistling could be heard from the 7 Colors Mountain. Lu Xiaoyi knew that the time was up. As the group of Golden Core cultivators boarded the ship, a round of inspection revealed that there were less than 100 of them. Most of them were 7-colored sword cultivators, and there were a dozen or so who had volunteered from the surrounding small continents. These people were very worthy of respect. They had cultivated and groped their way through the small continents by relying on their dedication to the sword. Being able to stand up meant that they understood the true meaning of swordsmen. This was not an orthodoxy that could be hidden away like a tortoise. The Cloud Sea flying ship was very big. It was big enough to fit everyone and still have room to spare. The ones steering the ship were also a few Dharma cultivators. Without a doubt, this ship must have come from some Taoist sect. Unorthodox sects like the 7 Color Sword sect would not be able to afford such a luxurious thing. Obviously, these Taoist sects were very attentive to this competition. They were in charge of collecting information and sending people. They even gave everyone healing medicine. It could be said that they spared no effort, except for the fact that they were restricted by the rules. Everyone was a chess piece. Chess piece? Lu Xiaoyi suddenly understood. In his imagination, he had never understood his understanding of the war in the cultivation world. He always thought that the so-called war in the cultivation world revolved around attacking and defending Shaking Shadow Continent. Therefore, he felt that Zhou Xian's war preparations were very naive. There was no surprise, no coordination, no tactics, and it seemed clumsy and old-fashioned. But what if this was still a chess game? No one told him this because the natives of Zhou Xian understood it themselves. But he did not understand because he was a fake. The white-browed old man used a chess game when he gambled with others. Xiao Yao and the 1,000 Buddhas used a chessboard to fight for Shaka. Then, how could the war between the Sword Vein Alliance and the Bitter Zen Temple not use a chessboard? It was impossible for thousands of people to jump up and down in the Cloud Sea, right? It was impossible to determine who would win and who would lose. But if it was a chess game with thousands of people, he was not worried about the ability of the heaven and earth chessboard. He was just curious. With so many people, what kind of chess pieces would they use? It was not easy to ask. As a Zhou Xian cultivator, this should be common knowledge. Was it possible that everyone on the ship understood it, but he was the only one who was confused? Don't call me mask, call me silly face. Go. Who's going to play? It was impossible for him to walk alone just once. Chinese checkers? Wasn't this too much of a joke? It couldn't hold Chinese chess either. The other types of chess don't seem right either. What kind of chess can accommodate thousands of people? The flying boat flew forward under Lu Xiaoyi's confusion. Its positioning was extremely accurate, and its speed was extremely fast. Gao Yang walked over and sat beside him. Has anyone in the Carefree Tour done any research on this? Lu Xiaoyi remained calm and collected. No one has any experience. How would there be anyone who would specialize in this? In any case, I've never studied it before, and I'm too lazy to even play Six Masters. How does the Sword Alliance plan to deal with this? Army self-moving chess was a very obscure chess style. In fact, it did not belong to two people. Instead, it depended on the chess pieces to decide their own moves. It was called self-moving. This was close to the highest level of chess in the heaven and earth chessboard. It was a chess game that would only be started when there was an invasion from the outside world. The only difference was that the scale was smaller and the cultivators' realms were lower. Because there were more people, the victory or defeat was not determined by the number of enemies killed, but by fighting for the enemy's military flag. The military flag was not like the general's flag in Chinese chess, which was exposed to the outside world. Instead, it was hidden in the thousands of troops on one side. It was full of coincidences and accidents, just like two armies fighting on the battlefield. There were no generals, ministers, chariots, and horses. Everyone was a pawn, and they could move around freely. The whole chessboard was like a Chinese checkers board that had been enlarged countless times. Every cultivator had their own independent chess piece space. Under normal circumstances, this space could accommodate at most two people. It was for both the attacking and defending sides. However, it was rare to see a situation where many people fought against few. Once the chess game started, hundreds of thousands of chess pieces on one side began to move forward. They could only move forward one space at a time and could not jump forward. When they met each other, they would start fighting. The winner would survive, and the loser would withdraw or die. There were many mysteries in this game. For example, where to hide one's military flag. Was it to move forward with the main army, or to guard the rear? The possible hiding place of the enemy's military flag? The direction of one's main attack? The direction of one's secondary attack? The direction of one's defense? There were many similarities between this and the battlefield in the mortal world. Gao Yang sighed. The upper realm of Zhou Xian hasn't had such a large-scale battle for many years. Everyone is the same. The key is the overall strength and quality of the cultivators on each side. If the sword vein is up against any of the 3,000 orthodox alliances, we have the confidence to win. However, if it's one of the 9 great upper sects, to be honest, our chances are not high. Lu Xiaoyi listened quietly and did not speak. Gao Yang did not expect him to answer. In a chess game with thousands of people, the power of one person was negligible, even if the person in front of him was the so-called carefree mask. Firstly, the sword vein has a mix of good and bad people. We can't go all out, so we have to leave some people to guard the mountain gate. Secondly, the 9-sword vein can't be united. I don't mean for anyone to fish in troubled waters and retreat. Since we're here, we all have the intention to contribute to the sword vein. However, swordsmen are generally unruly. If we don't have 100 people to respond to our call, we won't be able to form a united force. Thirdly, the bitter Zen temple's orders are united. This is an incomparable advantage for a great power. Fourthly, this time, the Buddhist sect has promised a chess game with thousands of people. They can choose the best of the best, but we can only scrape together. Lu Xiaoyi was expressionless. Then you still want to continue? Gao Yang looked out the window. We have to show the sword vein's attitude. That is, we won't compromise. In the Zhou Xian upper realm, such a small land existed. After the Buddhist sect gained control of it, the belief on the land was controlled. As time passed, the foundation of the native sects was gradually hollowed out. When they couldn't get support from a mortal world, how long could they last? There was once such a body cultivation sect that eventually left for other lands. There was also once such a soul cultivation sect that was cut off. Gradually, in a long river of time, your blood was slowly sucked dry, so that you couldn't absorb any nutrients. In the end, they were forced to hand over the land that their ancestors had owned to the Buddhist sect. Therefore, when the Yaoying land was also taken over by the Buddhist sect, we won't blame the Taoists for their incompetence. We can only fight on our own. Even if the Sword Vein Alliance is added together, the gap between us and the Bitter Zen Temple is hopeless, not to mention the huge gap in the level of major cultivators. Fortunately, the Zhou Upper Realm still has the heaven and earth chessboard. At least, we can still get a slightly fairer chance in the chess game. The Sword Vein can lose, but even if we lose, we have to hurt the Bitter Zen Temple on the level of Jindan. This is our goal. After the first time, there will be no end to it. Therefore, we can't give in. Chapter 833. Lu Xiaoyi was in awe, but he didn't show it, because he was now the carefree mask. What are the stakes of the chess game? Gao Yang took a deep breath. If we win, Buddhism will withdraw from preaching in Yaoying land. From then on, Yaoying land will no longer allow the upper sects to use their faith to meddle in it. They can take orders from any upper sect, but they won't accept fighting over Taoist and Buddhist faith. There are a few such little Lus in the Zhou Upper Realm, such as Hunduan Little Lu and Red River Little Lu. Back then, it was because of their own desperate struggle and the various coincidences of the general trend and environment that they were able to preserve their own orthodoxy and not accept the invasion of the faith of the big powers. Of course, most of the little Lus don't have such willpower. If you want to get it, you have to pay with blood. If we lose, then there's nothing to say. Yaoying Sword Palace will immediately withdraw from the little Lus and find another place. However, for our Sword Vein, there's a big difference between being chased away hundreds of years later and fighting with all our might now. Lu Xiaoyi listened to him quietly. This was also the sorrow of all the small powers in the Zhou Upper Realm. The Sword Vein was considered united. For most of the small orthodoxies, even if they wanted to resist, they couldn't find a way to do so. Perhaps there would only be hope if the 3,000 small powers united together. However, if that was the case, the 9 upper sects would also unite. As a struggle that happened once every few thousand years, there might still be a glimmer of hope. However, if resistance became a habit, what would be waiting for them? If Xinyuan Sword Sect was here, what would they do? One thing was certain: they would never agree to using the spread of faith as the basis for victory or defeat. Xinyuan people only believed in their own swords. They couldn't be bothered to spread anything. In the entire Zhou Upper Realm, there are only a few little Lus that have such independent treatment. There are too few who resist, and too many who submit. The history of Zhou is really regrettable. Gao Yang also sighed. Yes. However, after 10,000 years, the world has changed. I don't know how this method came about. It's truly baffling. Those monks have benefited from it for nothing. Lu Xiaoyi's heart skipped a beat. He realized that he had missed a very important point. The method of determining the ownership of a continent through the method of spreading faith was not something that had existed since the beginning of time, but had only existed for tens of thousands of years. He had been led astray by the heaven and earth chessboard. He thought that since the heaven and earth chessboard had existed for hundreds of thousands of years, the method of spreading faith must have existed for hundreds of thousands of years as well. However, if this method of determining the ownership of continents only began 10,000 years ago, what did it mean? Lu Xiaoyi couldn't figure it out, but it didn't matter. He had plenty of time. Gao Yang smiled bitterly. These things are ultimately for the top cultivators to consider. Whether Zhou Xian's surname will be Taoist or Buddhist in the future is not for little cultivators like us to think about. It's more realistic for us to talk about the things that concern us right now. It's like this. Although the 9 of us haven't reached an agreement on how to carry out this game of chess, we have a general idea. I know you don't want to participate, but there's one thing that may be related to you. Please tell me. Lu Xiaoyi was very calm. Gao Yang thought for a moment. In a large-scale battlefield, there are only two things that determine the outcome. One is the reserve team, and the other is the assault force. How to use these forces is the responsibility of the leaders of the sword vein. Since you don't want to, you may not be able to rally everyone, so let's not talk about this first. Since it's a strategic force, of course, we have to choose the most powerful cultivators. I'm afraid ordinary cultivators won't be able to do it. Then, what I want to ask is, do you want to join these two elite forces in order to make contributions? Or do you prefer to be free and do whatever you want? Lu Xiaoyi didn't hesitate. Senior brother Gao Yang, you don't have to consider me. I'm used to being undisciplined, and I'm not used to listening to other people's orders. I guess I'll just go with the flow in this game of chess. If I'm really assigned to a team and don't listen to orders, it'll be awkward for everyone, and it won't be nice. Gao Yang nodded. He had already expected this, but he still had to ask out of politeness. Free and unfettered wandering cultivators were famous for being undisciplined and unorganized. They were notorious for being undisciplined and unorganized in the upper realm of Zhouxian. Moreover, it was already not easy for them to come here and help. If they were really assigned to a suicide squad, how would they be able to do their best? He always believed that a swordsman was a true swordsman only if he stayed in the sword vein. Those who stayed in the Dharma vein were swordsmen who had changed their nature. They were no longer pure, no matter how high their cultivation level was. Watching Gao Yang leave, Lu Xiaoyi fell into deep thought. 10,000 years was a very sensitive period of time. In the hundreds of years that he had been cultivating, many major events had happened in this 10,000-year window. It made people's imaginations run wild. However, his current cultivation level was not high enough. There were many things that he had heard, and it was useless to think too much about it. As for joining the reserve team or the assault team that Gao Yang mentioned, this was not his style, unless he could control this team himself. Could he? Of course not. Therefore, he might as well be free. When it came to battles, he had his own unique judgment. This was his talent, and also the experience that he had accumulated through countless battles. The biggest problem that Xianyuan swordsman had was that he was unwilling to waste his life according to other people's methods. In the days that he spent in the airship, he could feel the determination of these swordsmen around him, especially those who did not belong to the seven-color sword sect. They were all swordsmen who had joined from various small continents. They all had the qualities of a true swordsman. It would be a pity if they were to die here. Army self-moving chess was not a death chess game. If they lost, they could quit. However, there was no king here that could speak for them like in the Shaja 6 chessboards. Therefore, pride, conceit, and sword heart would take their lives. This was the meaning of the existence of a king. It could help people maintain their Tao heart. Cultivators could comfort themselves by saying, I did not want to quit, but the king forced me to. He could not lead them and did not have the prestige. If they really followed him, they would probably die even faster. This was because Lu Xiaoyi's path was always more dangerous than others. As for the specific strategy, it was useless to think about it now. This was because army chess was an unfamiliar chess game to everyone. The last time it appeared was during the struggle of the Blood River Orthodoxy thousands of years ago. There were no specific historical records of it. He looked out of the porthole and saw the sea of clouds receding quickly. Then he came back to his senses and looked at the rules that Gao Yang had given him. There was not much time left. How could a person perform well on a chessboard with almost 2,000 people? It was not only based on strength, but also an incomparable understanding of the rules. This damned Zhou Xian upper realm. It was just a fight, but they set up a bunch of rules to restrict him. Could it be that they were not aware of it at all? They could not feel it when they were in the upper realm, and they could not feel it when they were in conflict with other upper realms? How strange. Chapter 834. After a month of flying, the Cloud Sea flying ship arrived above the shaking Shadowland. However, they did not descend. This battle would take place on the heaven and earth chessboard. No one wanted to descend to land. If they hurt mortals, they would be adding to their own karma. In the Sea of Clouds, 6 large Cloud Sea flying ships stopped. Like the rainbow sword, they did not show any signs of leaving. Instead, they were lined up in a row. Many Dharma vein cultivators were busily moving in and out. A huge banner had a few words written on it. Shaking Shadow, Chessboard Rescue Club. Obviously, these Cloud Sea flying ships could be seen as medical ships. They specialized in rescuing cultivators who were knocked down from the chessboard. Based on the orthodoxy of these healing cultivators, the monks would probably be delayed in coming down. If it was a swordsman who fell down, they would definitely be treated immediately. Of course, the monks would probably not accept their treatment. They had their own treatment. In the surrounding sea of clouds, large groups of swordsmen were scattered and gathered. They were basically separated by the sword vein. On the eve of the great battle, the atmosphere was tense and restless. Even from afar, one could feel the murderous aura permeating the air. There were still 2 sword vein that had not arrived. Based on the current situation, each sword vein had mobilized around 100 swordsmen. The difference was not great. They were all about the same size and naturally had similar strength. This army was limited to 1,000 people. The 9 sword vein had mobilized around 100 people each. Together, there were close to 1,000 people. This was all the sword vein alliance had, which was 30% to 40% of the overall strength of the sword vein. Among them, the Shaking Shadow Sword Palace had mobilized all of their forces. To them, there was no point in leaving behind Seed. A life and death struggle was the only way out. Shaking Shadow, Rainbow Sword, Knocking Sword Mountain, Sword Wind Tower, Heavenly Sword Lake, Dangtian Gate, Small Bell Mountain, Shueduo Long River. These were the 9 sword veins forces. Half a day later, the remaining 2 sword vein armies arrived one after another. The leaders began to gather together to discuss the strategy and coordination of the armies. They were all veterans with rich combat experience, but none of them were unreasonable people. There were some basic things that they all agreed on. The swordsman of the Sky Sword Pool, the most senior member of the Jindan, spoke on behalf of the Sky Sword Pool. The advantage of ascetic meditation lies in unity. After all, we are scattered and gathered. We will never be able to match up to it in terms of unity of command and action. Since that is the case, there is no need to force us to move as one. In fact, it is unrealistic for so many people to move as one on the chessboard. Mo, one of Knocking Sword Mountain, agreed. Elder Chuan is right. The best strategy is for the 9 sword vein armies to move in teams of 100. They are capable and agile, and they can coordinate with each other during the battle. To be honest, for such a big battle, it is impossible to have an overall plan. Once the battle starts, it will be a mess. It is more practical to improvise. Everyone nodded. The swordsman focused on actual combat. He knew that once a battle in the cultivation world began, it would be impossible to control the situation. It was better to be restrained by the way of chess on the heaven and earth chessboard. However, if they were to fight in the sea of clouds, it would be a rush. What strategy was there to talk about? Once the swordsman spread out, any formation would be messed up. In each sword vein, there were countless sword matrices to coordinate. They could not be used on the chessboard. However, this was not a bad thing. In terms of battle matrices, they could never compare to a top sect like ascetic meditation temple. The 7 colors Gao Yang suggested. Then let's decide on the order of the battle. Front, back, left, right, reserve, attack. The specific order of attack will have to be decided by ascetic meditation's battle formation after the battle. The battle was imminent, and the decision was firm. In the end, 6 out of the 9 sword vein armies would fight head-on against ascetic meditation's army of monks. The remaining 3 would be the reserve team. However, this did not mean that they could hide and relax. Their mission was to cover the gaps in the main battle line and attack when they found out where the enemy's army flag was hidden. In addition, there were 2 separate teams. One was an assault team made up of 4 top swordsmen from each sword vein. There were a total of 36 of them. If the enemy's army flag was located clearly, they would fight to the death. The other team was made up of scattered swordsmen. In each sword vein team, there were more or less a dozen scattered swordsmen from all over the world. They were not very compatible with the sect system, and it was difficult for them to form mutual trust in a short period of time. Therefore, they simply formed their own team and stayed at the side of the main battle line. They were responsible for intercepting, guerrilla warfare, harassing, and when necessary, cooperating with the main assault team to attack the enemy's army flag. 1,000 people, 11 teams, and nearly 100 people in a team. This was the best number of people to cooperate with. If there were fewer people, the collective strength would not be shown. If there were more people, it would be chaotic. As for how to communicate, and how to cooperate, some details were decided one by one. While they were discussing, the sound of Buddha came from afar. It was as if the whole space was under the gaze of Buddha. Before the monks of the Bitter Zen temple arrived, their momentum had already overshadowed the chaotic swordsmen. It was an Arhut formation formed by 9 monks. They did not have a flying boat, and they just flew all the way from the Bitter Zen continent. When they arrived, Lu Xiaoyi sighed. The demeanor of a big sect was not something that a small force could compare with. If this was a Xianyuan swordsman, they would definitely fly in a sword formation to cultivate their momentum. However, there were 9 sword vein, and they all flew in different directions. There was nothing that could be done. He knew very well that the sword vein alliance basically had no chance of winning against such a force in the chessboard of heaven and earth, unless they relied on sneak attacks and personal strength. Gao Yang came to his side again and roughly explained the arrangement. No matter what, this was a cultivator from the Carefree Travel sect. His identity was different, not for anything else, but for the real One Ear to have an easier life in the Carefree Mountain. He could not neglect this person. The 7 colors formation, the elite assault formation, and the scattered swordsman guerrilla attack formation. Where do you want to go, junior brother? Lu Xiaoyi said indifferently. I'll go with the scattered swordsman. It'll be more comfortable. I can fight freely and run freely. I don't have to listen to people's orders. Gao Yang nodded and did not say much. He had to coordinate the internal formation of the 7-color swordsman. Just now, it was just a general plan. As for the internal formation of each sword vein, it was also very important to know who stood at the front and who stood at the back. He was a little disappointed. No matter what, this person at least had a decent combat power. Whether he was a mask or not, if he could be included in the 7 colors formation, he would be of help. There was no such thing as taking one step at a time. It was purely up to oneself. If you wanted to move faster, you could constantly jump through the space of the chess pieces. At that time, when 2,000 people moved, there might be hundreds of battles happening at the same time. It was a very grand scene. Therefore, it was very important who stood at the front. The harder the soldier at the front was, the more likely it was to find the hiding place of the military flag. If it was not one of their own, they would not put in a lot of effort. What would they do? Chapter 835. The mighty power of Buddha filled the space between heaven and earth. The aura of nearly 1,000 arhats was released, and the chanting of sutras made it seem like they were in a Buddhist kingdom. Under the pressure of the Buddha power, every swordsman could not help but gather their strength to resist. The sound of swords humming could be heard from time to time. The weakest swordsman had to rely on his sword to stabilize his emotions. Lu Xiaoyi wondered how many swordsmen would be able to walk into the heaven and earth chessboard if the confrontation continued. Fortunately, they did not have to wait for too long. The sound of Zhongming rang in the sky, but it was not the 3 times like during the 6 swords, but 5 times. In the midst of the humming, all the cultivators on the scene disappeared one by one. In the next moment, Lu Xiaoyi felt that he had arrived at an ancient battleground. It seemed extremely small, like a cage, but also extremely large, and he could not see the end of it. This was the extreme use of space in the heaven and earth chessboard. The space of each cultivator's chess pieces did not seem large, but once the battle started, the space could be expanded instantly to satisfy the cultivator's battle needs. When there was no battle, the cultivator could stand at his position and observe the situation of the battlefield. The entire chessboard was hexagonal, and the chess pieces were arranged in 120 horizontal and 120 vertical. This was the largest number of spaces, and the further it went, the smaller the spaces were. There were only 60 spaces at the bottom. Lu Xiaoyi did a simple count, and there should be about 8,000 spaces, and the cultivators took up 2,000 of them. Because there was no general to command, there was a stage of setting up the chessboard at the beginning. Both sides would gather at the bottom of the chessboard, and when the game officially started, they would follow the plan and either wait for the opportunity to come or charge and break through the enemy lines with 10 moves. The swordsmen, under the lead of their respective senior brothers, took up their positions according to the pre-agreed order. Among the 9 sword vein, the shaking shadow, the sword wind tower, the sword knocking mountain, the celestial sword lake, the long river, and the 7 colors were in a line in front, separated by a few spaces. Behind them were the elite assault teams from the heaven-shaking sect, Shui Duo, Shao Zhong Mountain, and the others. They were ready to move out at any time. The scattered swordsmen were positioned at the outermost part of the right flank. Their position was neither up nor down. They were not in charge of attacking in groups, nor were they in charge of key directions. They were not the fire brigade, and no one would use them as cannon fodder. They were all fellow Taoists who had risked their lives to help. Every member of the sword vein shared the same mentality. The most tragic part of the battle should be the organized and disciplined forces of the sect. The method of using cannon fodder to exhaust the opponent in a mortal war was not advisable in a cultivation war. It would lose momentum. Looking at the opposite side, the arrangement of the monks was very simple and also very Buddhist. It was just 2 simple 500 arhat formations. This was the foundation of Buddhism. It was ever-changing and incomparably solid. It was a response that would not be affected by external factors. Whether it was on the chessboard of heaven and earth or in a real war in space, they would always use this method, and this method had rarely disappointed them. Lu Xiaoyi squeezed into the scattered swordsmen on the right side of the formation, looking around. The 2 sword vein members in charge of this group were Jin Dan. One was Xiao Wu from the Sword Wind Tower, and the other was Feng Bailey from Shaozhou Mountain. They were in charge of guiding the group. Of course, only God knew if these people would listen to orders when the battle really started. After all, they were only barely able to call out names. Although they were not assigned the most important task, the scattered swordsmen were all in high fighting spirit. They were also very clear that if they were not individually, but as a group, there was a gap between them and the sword vein forces. Every Jin Dan who had lived for hundreds of years was very clear about this point. However, they still believed that they would be able to perform outstandingly in this grand battle that was rarely seen in thousands of years. Therefore, they were very enthusiastic when it came to ranking. Because they were at the outermost right wing, the space in front of them was relatively narrow. Therefore, they were actually assigned to a chessboard width of only 6 squares. Next to them, only a few squares away, was the group from the 7-color sword sect. The scattered swordsmen had a total of 87 people. Including Xiao Wu and Feng Bailey, there were 89 people. Among all the groups in the sword vein, except for the elite assault team, the number of people in the sword vein formation was about the same. The swordsman assault team was, of course, in a wedge-shaped formation. There was no need to choose this position. It was definitely Xiao Wu's position, and Feng Qianli was in the middle to take care of him. This was the pride of the sword vein. They were the main force of this chessboard battle and the future beneficiaries. Therefore, it was their duty to stand in the most dangerous position, in a wedge-shaped formation. Other than the tip of the wedge, the most important thing was the practitioners in the front few layers. If they were strong, they would be able to kill their way through and pierce through the opponent's formation. If they were weak, they would be knocked out by the Buddhist sect. From the overall formation, there would be a gap. As the opponent attacked, this gap would become bigger and bigger. In the end, they would not be able to pierce through the opponent, but would be cut into 2 or even several pieces. Everyone was asked to take on such a heavy responsibility. They were not familiar with each other. It was almost as if each of them came from a small continent. How could they be completely different in terms of strength? Therefore, in the end, it was just Xiao Wu and Feng Qianli who liked each other. If they liked each other, they would be sent to the front. If they didn't like each other, they would be sent to the back. Lu Xiaoyi belonged to this type of person who would be sent to the back. This was because his Jin Dan middle stage cultivation was at an innate disadvantage in front of most of his companions who were in the late stage or even the peak stage. In the eyes of the seven-colored swordsmen who were commanding the seven-colored swordsmen, there was some disdain. You are very likely to be a powerful person with a carefree mask. Is there a need to hide your cultivation level and come here to do the work without putting in any effort? It would be better if you didn't come. Even if you were weaker, you would still be willing to risk your life. 89 people, 6 horizontal rows. That was to say, the depth of the whole team reached 15 floors. Lu Xiaoyi was on the 15th floor, and his position was in the middle of the horizontal row. That was to say, there were people on both sides. This was the safest position in the team on the battlefield. If a fight broke out, no one could attack him for the time being. This was not deliberately chosen by him, but there was nothing to be picky about, because they had already made preparations before entering the chessboard of heaven and earth. The formation of each formation was very fast. Furthermore, the members of the sect were more obedient. They were not like the scattered swordsmen who were dissatisfied and indignant. It was as if being placed at the back was a kind of insult. Everyone had their own preferences, but the basic principle was that the first few layers would definitely be the strongest. Perhaps there were some differences in the formation, and different battle habits and preferences were taken into consideration. However, to the swordsman, offense was the main theme. To attack, one had to use the best steel on the blade. No matter which universe, no matter which sword vein orthodoxy, this would never change. As for the Buddhists, they were the best at dissipating the opponent's sharpness into nothingness. They were even better at it than the orthodox Taoists. Chapter 836. In the past few days, Lu Xiaoyi had already thoroughly studied the game's rules and style. There were many rules, and the most important ones were as follows. First, the exact location of the enemy's flag could only be discovered when one was within 7 squares of the flag. The flag could move with the army, which meant that just discovering it was not enough to solve the problem. One had to attack in the shortest time possible, or else the enemy would change positions within the army and disappear without a trace. Second, each chess piece space could only accommodate 2 cultivators. In other words, it would always be a one-on-one battle, unless the chess piece was surrounded by the enemy. But in the flag space, it could accommodate 7 people. In other words, if you were to charge in alone, you could be surrounded by 6 cultivators. Of course, before the enemy entered the flag space, the defending cultivators were not allowed to enter their own flag space. Considering that the position of the flag was usually heavily guarded by the defending cultivators, and that the attacking cultivators could only break through from one direction, it was very possible for a 1-on-6 battle to occur. This point could be taken as a reference to Chinese checkers. Around each chess piece, there would be 6 chess pieces next to it, like a plum blossom. If one wanted to gain an advantage in numbers, or at least not be at a disadvantage, one would need to break through many points around the flag. Simply put, the way of the king was to send a large number of troops forward, and charging in alone was very dangerous. Third, a cultivator could only advance 1 square at a time, so he could only challenge the opponents in the 6 squares of the plum blossom petals around him. He could not exceed the squares, and this required time. The change was that after a cultivator won 3 times, his movement distance would increase from 1 square to 2 squares. He could attack 12 opponents within 2 squares, and of course he could also choose to attack 6 opponents around him. The range of opponents would then increase to 18 in the shape of a large plum blossom. When a cultivator won 5 matches in a row, his movement distance would increase to 3 squares. When he won 7 matches in a row, his movement distance would increase to 4 squares. When he won 9 matches in a row, his movement distance would increase to 5 squares. After he won 11 matches in a row, his movement distance would increase to 6 squares. At the same time, when he formed a sword formation with other cultivators, he would be able to move the entire sword formation by 2 squares. This was a qualitative change in movement from an individual to a group. After winning 13 matches in a row, he would be able to move 7 squares himself, and he would be able to move 3 squares with the sword formation. After winning 15 matches in a row, he would be able to move 8 squares himself, and he would be able to move 4 squares with the sword formation. After winning 17 matches in a row, he would be able to move 9 squares himself, and he would be able to move 5 squares with the sword formation. After winning 19 matches in a row, he would be able to move 30 squares himself, and there would be no restrictions. Along with the sword formation, it also rose to 9 squares. This was only in theory. In reality, if one wanted to win 19 matches in a row, the opponents would all be Dragon Tiger Arhats who could grind and pester. Just the consumption of energy was something that no one could withstand. Therefore, it was only a rule, but no one could do it. What was the point of a single person moving unhindered in a battlefield with thousands of people? If they were too far away, they wouldn't even be able to see the position of the flag. How would they be able to kill the general and capture the flag with 10,000 soldiers? Fourth, victory or defeat was not only determined by capturing the flag, but also by guarding the flag. Defending the flag not only depended on the time, but also on the attack and defense rounds. In other words, the flag-seizing side had to defend the chessboard world for a day and run all day, making it impossible for the defending side to block the military flag space. Or, the flag-seizing side had to successfully defend the military flag space 3 times. Only then would the flag-seizing side be considered a success. There are many other similar rules, but the most important ones were these few. They would determine the core of both sides' attack and defense strategy. Both sides had finished their preparations, and there were no longer any movements on the chessboard. With Buddha in their hearts and sword in their hands, an austere aura permeated the entire chessboard space. At this moment, the killing intent of the swordsmen began to grow stronger and converge together. Finally, they were able to match the imposing aura of the Buddhists. Although it was still thin in terms of thickness, the irrepressible sharpness had been fully displayed, and it wasn't something that the Buddhist chants could control. The sword vein, the most indomitable orthodoxy of the universe's cultivation world, had finally revealed their true nature. Towards the people or powers that were trying to dig the sword vein's roots, their only answer was the sword in their hands. In the sky, the chime of the chime suddenly exploded with a resounding chime. The 213 Jindan from the Shadow Sword Palace in the center all took a step forward. This was all they had, and they held nothing back. Either victory or death, there was no third option. Following closely behind were the other 10 teams. They did not hesitate at all. Regardless of whether it was the vanguard, the reserves, the elite teams, or the individual teams, all of them moved forward. The so-called reserves were only reserves in the sense of understanding, but they couldn't really stay in the same spot. Otherwise, if there were any changes in front, with so many spaces, how would they be able to arrive in time? They had to seize the center line as soon as possible. Only then would they have more room to maneuver. The Buddhists made the same choice. No matter how Buddhist-like they were, they couldn't just hand over the initiative to others. It was just that they didn't move as quickly as the swordsmen. At this speed, the first contact between both sides should be 10 spaces away from the center line. Lu Xiaoyi could clearly see that this position of the Buddhists wasn't moving slowly, but if they were to coordinate with the 2 great Arhat formations, they would be able to cover the entire battlefield. And this was also a battle strategy that had been carefully thought out. The 2 great Arhat formations were like 2 gigantic human meat grinders. One great Arhat formation had 500 people, while the other great Arhat formation had 49 people. It was less than 1,000 people, and he didn't know what this had to do with the Tao of Heaven's lack of one. He couldn't tell which army the flag was in either. Was it in the center of the great Arhat formation, or at the back of the great Arhat formation? Not to mention the position of the monk's army flag. He didn't even know the position of the Sword Vein Alliance's army flag. This was the highest secret of the battlefield, and only the leaders of the Sword Vein like Gao Yang had the right to know, as well as the small number of swordsmen who guarded the army flag. The swordsmen leaped forward in the space of the chess pieces. Liu Xiaoyi found it funny, just like the goose steps of the military parade in some countries in his previous life. However, this movement of the cultivators was even more shocking. If there was a camera that could look down from above, the cultivators leaped out of the chess piece space like a huge school of fish leaping out of the water, and then plunged into the next chess piece space like a school of fish entering the water, rising and falling, rising and falling, rising and falling continuously, and it was a magnificent sight. In the whole school of fish, not a single fish fell behind, or stayed behind out of fear. They were a real school of fish, following their instincts and migrating for the continuation of their lives. Xiao Wuwa and Feng Bailey had been suppressing the speed of the swordsmen. After all, they were guerrilla forces and not the main force. If they rashly rushed to the front, it would be disadvantageous to the overall situation, and it would affect the overall situation. This was very taxing on their strength. Although they were full of fighting spirit, and their feelings were understandable, they lacked discipline. Fortunately, under their strong restraint, the formation was maintained well. The two sides of the Sword Vein Alliance didn't change their route, just like when they first set up the formation. However, when they were 20 chess pieces away from the center line, the forces of the Sword Vein Alliance began to divert and converge to one side. At this time, the ascetic Arhats were still 30 chess pieces away from the center line. The forces that diverted were Sword Knock Mountain, Sword Wind Tower, Long River, Shaking Shadow, and Heavenly Sword Lake. 5 of the 6 Sword Vein Alliance's main forces were facing the anti-Arhut formation. Following closely behind were the Dang Tian sect and Shui Duo, the elite assault team. Obviously, the strategy of the Sword Vein Alliance was to attack one of the Arhut formations first and try to destroy it in one go. At the very least, they had to find out if the army flag was in there. Chapter 837. Such a change was in line with the swordsman's temperament. In fact, no one would be able to determine the location of the Buddhist flag just by looking at some clues. What the Buddhists revealed could also be a deliberate illusion. The swordsman's way of dealing with such a problem was very simple. Take a gamble. If not, change to another one. As for which one to gamble on, whether it was the Arhut formation or the anti-Arhut formation depended purely on their mood and intuition. In the end, they chose the anti-Arhut formation, and a total of 8 teams charged forward. On the right flank, they left the 7-color sword sect, the backup team of Xiaozhong Mountain, and the individual swordsman team to restrain the Arhut formation. Using less than 300 people to restrain an Arhut formation of 500 people, the difficulty was obvious. If they really went against them, it would be normal for them to be defeated. However, they couldn't look at it that way. How stupid would the monks be to use the Arhut formation to deal with 300 people, and leave the anti-Arhut formation to be surrounded by the swordsmen? Therefore, the monks might not be under much pressure. Xiao Wu's divine sense was transmitted to everyone's mind. We can't use brute force to attack. This would lose the meaning of splitting up the troops. If we are eliminated before the main force defeats the anti-Arhut formation, the main force will be attacked by 2 Arhut formations from 2 directions. Therefore, our goal is to engage in guerrilla warfare and sweep the sides. The longer we restrain the Arhut formation, the more help it will be to the main force. Listen to my orders and don't attack without permission. This is my request for you. No one retorted. They were all Jin Dan with hundreds of years of life experience. They knew very well that a 500-man formation against a 700-man formation or a 300-man formation against a 500-man formation, which one would last longer? The monks on the main forces side would definitely last longer. This was decided by the number of people and if they considered the cooperation between the Arhats. Therefore, their principle was to survive and drag it out, making the Arhut formation hesitate between splitting up the troops and not splitting up the troops. This was a very smart decision, and for the monks in charge of the team, it was the least they could do. The swordsman's main attack didn't stop at all as it continued to surge forward. The Shaking Shadow Sword Palace was at the very front. This might be their last performance in the cultivation world. Every one of them had the mentality of bursting forth with the final brilliance of their lives. The Buddha's voice was vast and mighty, and the sword chi exploded in the sky. The two torrents collided with each other, followed by the power of the other five-sword vein. Once the battle began, there was no retreat. The swordsmen were well aware of the gap between them and the doormen. However, this gap was not insurmountable as long as they were willing to pay the price with their lives. Almost at the same time, dozens of battles broke out at the same time. However, these battles were buried deep within the Go Peace space, so outsiders were unable to know about them. Because of the special rules of army chess, after the first round, the following players would not be able to move forward. If they wanted to join the battle, they would have to wait for their comrades in front to die or leave. Of course, if their comrades won, but were injured too much, they could replace them. This was allowed by the rules. The battle choices of the two sides were completely opposite. The swordsmen wanted to end the battle as quickly as possible, exchanging life for life, exchanging injury for injury. It was a strategy where both sides would suffer and die. This was their only correct choice. They used their blood and vigor to offset the opponent's stronger cultivation, stronger Buddhist weapons, and more profound skills. The bitter Zen temple's arhats were the exact opposite. They were trying their best to stall for time because they had Changli on their side. Not only were their cultivations stronger, their recovery was also better. Only by delaying the swordsmen could they fully unleash the Arhat formation's killing power. It was endless and endless. Relatively speaking, the right side's battle was 2 chess pieces later than the left side's battle. This was because the leader was deliberately suppressing them. As long as the Arhat formation in front of them didn't change, they were even willing to drag it out forever. However, the Arhat formation wouldn't give them such a chance. The Arhat formation slowly turned, but the angle wasn't big. Obviously, they believed in the defensive ability of the other anti-Arhat formation. The reason why they weren't in a hurry was because they wanted to attack from the side after the main force was entangled with the anti-Arhat formation. The monks didn't hide this goal. They were going to force the 3 teams that were in charge of delaying the Arhat formation to take the initiative to attack them instead of using the huge Arhat formation to capture the 3 agile teams. The leaders of the 3 teams had already made a decision. Their mission was indeed to stall for time, but not to avoid the battle. The monk strategy now forced them to take the initiative to harass the Arhats. This was within their expectations. How could they delay the Arhats without shedding any blood? The Arhat formation had only deviated by 1 chess piece when the 3 swordsman teams suddenly sped up. Due to the location, the rainbow sword vein was responsible for attacking between the Arhat formation and the anti-Arhat formation. In other words, they were attacking from the inside of the Arhat formation. As for the solo swordsmen, because they were at the outermost position, it was the most convenient for them to attack from the outside of the Arhat formation. Little Zhong Mountain's mission was the most important. Their mission was to block the Arhat formation from the front. Of course, they couldn't completely block the Arhat formation, but they needed to stall for time as much as possible. Because they weren't in the main direction of attack, their fighting style was different from the main battlefield on the left. The rainbow swordsmen and the solo swordsmen didn't attack from the front. Instead, they used the depth of their attacks to erase their opponents. It was like 2 boats, one big and one small. If they collided, the small boat wouldn't be able to survive and could only brush against the side of the boat. In the process of brushing against each other, they would exhaust the opponent and delay the opponent. It was like 2 small boats, the rainbow and the solo swordsmen sandwiching the Arhat formation. Little Zhong Mountain's opponents were also full of wisdom. They didn't forcefully resist, but instead, they took a step forward and took a step back. Occasionally, they would counterattack. Lu Xiaoyi was very impressed. Although the swordsmen's tactics seemed rough and crude at first, they were very flexible when it came to actual combat. Up until now, all of their choices have been impeccable, as expected of a fighting orthodoxy. The two sides on the right flank of the main battlefield were already intertwined with each other. There were sharp swordsmen who managed to penetrate the Arhut formation, and there were also powerful Arhut formations who managed to counter the Arhut formation. Victory and defeat had already been decided in the space of tens of chess pieces. The result was also very normal. The Arhut formation had the upper hand, maintaining a probability of 2-1. In the end, a battle of strength between cultivators wasn't something that could be resolved by hot-bloodedness. However, the main force of the sword vein still had hope. This was because the number of sword vein on the left flank was greater and thicker. More importantly, although most of the people who lost in the battle were swordsmen, most of the time, they had used their lives to inflict injuries on their opponents. Thousands of chess pieces were piled up in a narrow space. They couldn't advance or retreat. There was no other way but to advance. After killing a swordsman, another swordsman would pounce on them. It was still a life for a life. How many times could they last? The cultivators on the left flank were like dumplings being thrown into the chessboard of heaven and earth. There were more casualties than injuries. At the same time, the battle on the right flank had already begun. Chapter 838. Lu Xiaoyi's individual swordsman team moved towards the Arhut formation. As this was the first time they came into contact with the Arhut formation, in order to prevent their opponents from ignoring them, they made a deeper cut. They had to make the monks feel the pain. He was in the 15th row, which was why he had the time to observe from the sidelines while his companions in the 7th and 8th rows were engaged in battle. The Arhuts were solemn and dignified. They disdained the attacks of the individual swordsmen. This was the foundation of a great power, the confidence accumulated over time. The battle immediately began, and the forward movement stopped abruptly. The battle was intense, but the cultivators outside could not see it. Although the swordsmen wanted to end the battle quickly, it depended on the strength of both sides. It was not something the swordsmen could decide. However, the Arhut formation did not stop. It continued to move inwards. This was an inevitable choice. They could not move outwards. If they did, they would only move further away from the other Arhut formation. Therefore, among the three teams, the individual swordsman team was in the safest position. They did not have to worry about the Arhut formation's counterattack. Feng Qianli, who was in the middle, assessed the situation. The Arhut formation had also begun to move. The Arhut formation's movement had slowed down significantly, and the outcome of the first battle had yet to be decided. They had to make full use of their chess power. Lu Xiaoyi knew that other than his companions who were engaged in battle, what the remaining swordsmen needed to do was to change from the back to the front. The bottom row would be the front row, and they would stick close to the front row. This made the swordsmen, who had been yearning for battle, very excited. In the beginning, the scratching had been directed at each other, but now it was a smooth scratching. Lu Xiaoyi was in the front row, but he still could not enter the battle. Among the three people in the 15th row, he was in the middle. The battle would start with the swordsman on the right. What he needed to do was to be ready to fill in at any time. His attention was not focused on the battle in the chess piece space beside him. Instead, he was observing the entire battlefield, trying to find traces of the enemy's flag. Unfortunately, he did not find anything. The anti-Arhut formation had already fought 3 or 4 rounds. However, compared to the Arhut formation, this was only the surface. It was far from penetrating deep. He needed to do something for the sword vein. It wasn't that he wanted to escape from the swordsman group, but he knew very well that his way of doing things wouldn't be accepted by a sect. There were too many rules and regulations, and there was no room for him to freely express himself. That was why he chose to stay in the group and seek opportunities. Where was the opportunity? One was to discover the position of the enemy's flag and force their way in. The other was to minimize the losses of the swordsmen and preserve more seeds for the sword vein. To do this, they had to selectively kill the powerful dragon tiger Arhuts and even the thorn monks. They were the only ones who could deal the most damage to the swordsman. No matter what it was, one of the basic requirements was that he had to have extraordinary mobility just like how he controlled a sword in the sky, moving without a trace. In other words, he had to kill enough people first. The battle had just begun, but he had to start preparing. He doesn't have any prejudice against Buddhism. What Taoist Mo said to him was correct, but he didn't say that the role played by Taoism in the history of cultivation in the universe was actually no different from that of Buddhism. Don't talk about your elder brother. However, he didn't have a preference for Buddhism, but he did have a preference for his own sword vein. No matter which sword range orthodoxy in which universe, he had the obligation to lend a helping hand if he could. This was his principle. Not to mention the Buddhist sect, even if it was the Taoist sect standing opposite him, there was no obstacle that he could not strike. There was no such thing as being wishy-washy in the battle of the great Tao. Just kill. There was no karma involved. Song Rong, who was in the 14th row, stared straight ahead. There were two chess pieces fighting in front of him. He needed to fill in the gap between the chess pieces in the 15th row instead of the original battle space of his companions in the 14th row. This was an oblique, progressive strategy. The advantage of this was that he could attack the enemy while moving the formation. When the entire team was moving forward normally, his 14th row should fill in the gap left by his 13th row comrade's defeat. His own position would be filled by the 15th row swordsman, and the whole team would move forward. But now that everyone had turned around, he should fill in the 15th row's position, and his own position would be filled by the 13th row. Victory aside, if he lost, he had to charge in immediately. Therefore, he was staring at the chess piece space where Lu Xiaoyi's comrade was fighting. He hoped that the battle would move faster, not because he wanted to participate in the battle, but because the faster the battle, the more the swordsman could grasp the rhythm of the battle. The slower the battle, the more dangerous it would be. His wish came true. The aura of the 15th row swordsman's comrade suddenly fluctuated, turning from a dull gray to a bright yellow. He was furious. He knew that his comrade from the sword vein was in trouble, but now was not the time to reminisce. Now was the perfect time for revenge. His movements were quick. He leaped into the chess piece space, but the figure in front of him was even faster than him. He could not react in time and crashed into the chess piece space, only to be violently bounced back. Motherf asterisk cur. Do you even know the rules? Fill in the gap diagonally. That position is mine. Despite knowing that his opponent could not hear him, Song Rong had no choice but to fill in for his comrade's original position. He was a rule-abiding person. He had to move forward, or else it would affect his comrade's progress. He hated people who did not follow the rules the most, even though he was also eager to take revenge. Just as he stood firmly in the chess piece space of his comrade, the aura of the chess piece space in front of him fluctuated again. However, this time, it was blood red instead of the bright yellow of Buddhism. His revenge was a success, but the winner of this battle was the unruly fellow. Perhaps his comrade who died in the previous battle had dealt a heavy blow to his opponent, which was why the battle ended so quickly. Regardless of whether it was because he took advantage of the situation or because he was strong enough, a victory was a victory. However, since they had already fought, according to the rules, let's switch positions. It's my turn now. This was the rule of the swordsman's battle formation. After a battle, the comrade behind them would switch positions. This way, they could avoid fighting continuously and being exhausted to death. Just like that Arhut from before. He had just killed a swordsman and did not have the time to switch positions before this guy took advantage of him. But what infuriated Song Rong was that the guy who didn't know the rules turned a deaf ear and didn't move an inch. Before he could say anything else, the ascetic Zen monk beside him had already rushed into the space. Swordsmen could beat a drowning dog, and so could they. Chapter 839. You idiot. Do you want to die? Song Rong decided to complain to the leader of the team. However, Xiaohua and Feng Bailey were still fighting in the chess piece space, so they had to wait for a while. Just as he was complaining to the swordsman beside him that the 15th row was too reckless and did not follow the rules, the chess piece space vibrated again. Is he going to leave so recklessly? Too bad. He's too courageous. A swordsman sighed, but before he could finish his sentence, the chess piece space exploded with a blood-red color. Quickly change positions. We'll do it for you. The swordsmen around him shouted, but they were not as fast as the Longhu Arhut monk who was closest to them. Just like the swordsmen, they were especially wary of consecutive battles like this. It was rare for them to be able to escape safely after killing one of them. The swordsman had already killed 2 monks in a row, and there was only one left who could directly attack him. How could he let him go? 2 swordsmen tried to change positions in the chess piece space, but they were all bounced back. They could only watch as the Arhut monk rushed into the chess piece space, but they could not stop him. They were limited by their formation, so they could not take the initiative to attack, even though they were separated by a chess piece. Who does he think he is? Look, I'm right beside him, and I don't even have a chance to fight. When senior brother Xiao comes out, I'll definitely make him punish his bad habit of eating alone. More importantly, even if you're made of iron, how many nails can you make? Song Rong was still complaining when a swordsman beside him sighed. If senior brother Xiao doesn't come out, I'm afraid you won't be able to find him. There's only senior brother Feng left, and the outcome of the battle hasn't been decided yet. Everyone was silent. Who would be willing to die? They weren't the only ones who learned the way of the sword in the immortal of Zhou Upper Realm. However, they were the most ambitious and fearless of all the independent sword cultivators. Even so, this was still an extremely heavy topic. If senior brother Feng doesn't come out, what should we do? A swordsman raised a very realistic question. Before the others could answer, the aura of the chess piece that had already been through 4 consecutive battles surged. The blood-red color was exceptionally dazzling. In other words, the swordsman had already killed 3 monks. One was an active attack, while the other 2 were passive defense. Their characteristics were the same, and their speed was unimaginable. Then, a figure flashed out and looked around. That's it. Everyone was stunned. Because the other battles in the queue had not ended, they could not move forward. Otherwise, it would cause a disconnect between the front and back. Song Rong, who had been suppressing his dissatisfaction, did not dare to say anything. Killing 3 Arhut monks on the spot already explained some problems. On the other hand, a swordsman beside him said, "Senior brother, you're really something? May I know your name? Which continent did they come from?" "Brothers, you could be considered to have recognized an expert." Lu Xiaoyi looked behind him. Many battles were still going on. It was not easy for the entire formation to advance. He did not want to stand out too much and put on a show of sweeping the enemy formation. Of course, he might not be able to do so. "Xiao Yao Yu One Ear, I have nothing to do, so I'm here to buy some soy sauce. How should I address you guys?" Blue Planet Chase, yeah. Lin Yuan Nandang, Huan Hai Fei Sha, Gushi Tsong Rong. Lu Xiaoyi cupped his fist and said, "I was so excited that I forgot about the rules. Actually, I feel that this so-called army formation is just an empty name. Why don't we just let our hearts loose and get it over with? Why do we have to set up these strange rules to restrict people?" Everyone nodded in agreement. This kind of battle strategy might not have much of an impact on the swordsman's tactics. The space of the chess pieces was enough for them to use. However, in terms of strategy, it was very frustrating. They could only watch from the sidelines while others fought. A swordsman asked, "Senior Sean, what should we do next?" This question was very knowledgeable. It meant that Xiao Wuo was either dead or injured and was no longer in the game. Feng Baili also had a 50% chance of coming out. So, if he did not come out, who would they listen to? To the swordsman, there was only one choice, and that was to listen to the one with the biggest fist. If the one with the biggest fist was from Xiao Yaoyu, then it meant that he had both strength and status. There was no doubt about it. It was not that the swordsman had to find someone to rely on, but in this heaven and earth chessboard, there was no room for individual heroism. Only by cooperating with each other would they be able to achieve the greatest effect. To a leader, not only did they need to have a certain level of comprehensive judgment and decision-making, they also needed to be able to survive on the chessboard for a long time. Xiao Wu's leadership was not bad, but he met a tough opponent and lost in the first round. This was very awkward. The leader of the swordsmen could not hide in the back and give orders. Lu Xiaoyi did not reply. He did not want to seize power, but it seemed that there was no harm in doing so. At the very least, the 20 swordsmen who were below the 10th level were still very impressed with his strength. His gaze swept across the entire battlefield. Based on the initial situation, there were already more than 300 cultivators who had suffered. Among them, there were about 100 Arhut monks, while the swordsmen's losses had already reached 200. This was the true manifestation of the strength of both sides. There were still hundreds of battles in progress. Judging from the pattern, it was probably related to this trend that would embarrass the swordsmen. The strength of the monks of Bitter Zen Temple was not as great as the five-ring Sanqing, but it was not a fundamental difference. However, the strength of the swordsmen of the Zhou Xian Upper Realm was fundamentally different from that of the Xianyuan sword sect, especially since there was no inner swordsman among them. There was no backbone. He did not have much time. Although the chessboard of the army chessboard was huge and there were many chess pieces, due to the unique rules of the game, hundreds of battles would start at the same time. Therefore, the overall progress of the game was not much slower than the 6 gambling chess. There were still no signs of the enemy's flag being exposed. This was to be expected, just like how the Sword Vein Alliance's flag was not exposed either, since it was not possible for him to detect the location of the Bitter Zen Temple's flag. The only thing he could do now was to eliminate the strongest Arhut monks for the Sword Vein Alliance. At the same time, he could accumulate more kills for himself. Feng Baili seemed to be trapped in the chess piece space and refused to come out. He did not want to wait like an idiot, so he spoke up. We can't keep waiting like this. If Feng Baili doesn't come out, are we just going to wait like this? Are we going to watch Xiao Zhongshan and Rainbow hold on by themselves? We are the only team without any pressure. If there's no pressure, we'll look for pressure ourselves. Who's willing to come with me? The 20 or so swordsmen around him answered in unison. They knew that Single Ear was right. They could not just sit around and wait until they were powerless to turn the tables. It was not good for them to take the lead because they were all solo players. If they missed the opportunity, they would probably be blamed by the Sword Vein. However, Single Ear was different. He was from the house of Wandering Swordsmen, so his background was much stronger than theirs. He could handle it. Chapter 840. Their movements attracted the swordsmen in front of them. Other than the swordsmen who needed to take turns to retreat around their companions who were in battle, the other swordsmen were still willing to start a new batch of swordsmen and fight a big battle. This kind of rubbing made them feel very depressed, but there was no place for them to vent their anger. There were originally 89 people in their group, and 76 of them were still alive. Other than those who could not make it in time, and those who had to stay behind to support their comrades in battle, there were about 30 people gathering behind him. Lu Xiaoyi pointed at a corner of the Arhut formation. We will enter from here in a wedge-shaped formation. We will penetrate it. There will be no rotation. We will not wait for anyone. If anyone is left behind, don't fight the monks nearby. Think of a way to catch up. No rotation and no waiting meant that if they were too slow, they would be ruthlessly left behind. This was a cruel tactic. Being alone almost meant death, but it was undeniable that this was the most suitable method for a swordsman. Some swordsmen were worried. What if we can't penetrate it? Won't we be surrounded by the monks? Lu Xiaoyi burst into laughter. With one of my ears, there is no battle formation on this chessboard that cannot be penetrated. What you need to do is to follow my footsteps. If you can't, you will die with the sword. It was a form of provocation and also a form of disdain. In such a battlefield, it was the best way to provoke people. About 30 people gathered behind Lu Xiaoyi in a wedge-shaped formation. Lu Xiaoyi pointed to the front. We swordsmen, what is there to live for? What is there to fear about death? Moving with the sword is the joy of life. For the first battle, watch me. If you can't calculate the time, it will prove that you are not qualified to follow me. As he spoke, the tip of the wedge-shaped formation was the first to penetrate the Arhut formation. The swordsman at the back had seen this position clearly. It was the Dragon Tiger monk who had killed 2 swordsmen. With such a choice, everyone could not help but admire the carefree swordsman's care. Space trembled, and he disappeared without a trace. Space trembled again, and a blood-red sunset appeared. Lu Xiaoyi snapped. How many breaths? The swordsman's heart was surging. They could not control themselves and shouted together, 5 breaths. Lu Xiaoyi immediately jumped to the next monk's chess piece, cursing, Mother asterisk her. I'm not playing well. I'm killing too slowly. Brothers, follow me closely. I don't want to waste time. The sword whistled loudly as the wedge-shaped sword array entered. Everyone told themselves in their hearts that they only had 5 breaths of time. After they came out, they would still be able to maintain their original position in the wedge. At most, they could not exceed 10 breaths of time. They might still be able to hang on to the tail of the wedge. Otherwise, even if they won, the team would have already left by the time they came out. Lu Xiaoyi's second attack took 15 breaths of time. He could not maintain the rhythm of killing a swordsman within a few breaths of time. There was actually an element of luck involved in this. Moreover, he was very clear that if he had completely followed his own rhythm, these 30 swordsmen would have all died here. Therefore, he could provoke them with his words, but when he really did it, he had to leave enough time for his companions. Not everyone had such an abnormal attack power like him. If that was the case, this game of chess would lose its meaning. In the third formation, he was pinned to the spot by bitter Zen monk's counterattack. In the fourth formation, he turned around and attacked the dragon tiger monk who had killed 2 swordsmen consecutively from 3 chess pieces away. The monk's intention was to avoid the strongest swordsman, the leader of the swordsman's wedge formation. However, he did not expect that Lu Xiaoyi had already killed 5 swordsmen. Therefore, his movement was not just 1 chess piece, but 3. He blended into the wedge formation, and the chess pieces were in a mess. However, few people noticed his movements, except for his own people in the wedge formation. The alpha wolf was so sharp and invincible. It clashed back and forth, picking on the strong Arhats who had already killed. This greatly boosted the confidence of the swordsman. Now, no one thought that it was impossible to break through. It was not like they wanted to break through the entire Arhat formation. It was just a corner. When they were in a good mood and confident, they were more relaxed and dared to move more freely. This was because they believed that they had a strong backing. The depth of this corner was only 11 chess pieces, and there were still some empty spaces. When Lu Xiaoyi came out from the other side, there was already an empty space in front of him. There was not a single enemy left. This was the first time he led the individual swordsman into battle. He could not eat too much, or he would burst his stomach. He was just familiarizing himself with the situation. The real battle was yet to come. Behind him, the sword cultivators followed him out one by one. At this moment, the clumsiness of the great Arhat formation was shown. If a team was sent to pursue, they would leave the formation and draw closer to another formation. Faced with a small target and the big picture, the person in charge of the great Arhat formation decisively chose to maintain the big picture and temporarily let go of this group of swordsmen who had suddenly emerged as a new force. A monk was filled with righteous indignation. Senior, are we just going to let them get away with it? The leader monk's face was cold. The light of Buddha shines everywhere. They can't run away. But now, we have more important things to do. These people are greedy for momentary gratification. However, with this kind of action, they have already pulled away from us. They can't catch up with us. They're just trash, focusing on small gains and losing integrity. What a joke. Feisha is here. Nandang is here. Chase Xie is alive. Song Rong is not dead. Pointing at the 6 or 7 ascetic Zen monks that were cut out, Lu Xiaoyi smiled cruelly. Surround them. Don't let a single one escape. More than 10 sword cultivators responded loudly and surrounded him. When more than 5 out of the 6 chess pieces around a chess piece were occupied by the enemy, they could use numbers to fight against the enemy. Of course, the swordsman wouldn't stick to the rules of one-on-one duels. Now was the time to beat them up. Lu Xiaoyi looked at them and sighed in his heart. A general success was built on thousands of bones. The ancients were right. When the wedge-shaped sword formation was first established, there were 29 swordsmen. Now, only 16 of them were still alive, and almost all of them were injured. However, the overall result of their attack this time was much better than the sword vein. Excluding him, they were basically tied with the monks. If he were to be included, it would be an obvious victory. Of course, there was a very important prerequisite for this. Almost all of the tough bones were taken care of by him alone. While the 16 swordsmen were surrounding the monks, the rest of the individual swordsman team had also caught up. They were not far away and were looking at their comrades, killing to their heart's content. They couldn't help but yearn for it. Swordsmen, this was the kind of battle that they pursued. Victory and defeat, life and death were secondary. Although they had lost more than 10 swordsmen, the newly joined swordsmen had expanded the team to almost 50. They also wanted to join in such a hearty hunting feast. This was the moment that every swordsman yearned for the most. Lu Xiaoyi was a little hesitant. However, his hesitation was quickly dispelled by someone. Feng Bailey stood up. The leader of the army is the one who is capable. With Senior Shan here, how can I, Feng Bailey, be worthy of this position? For the sake of my brother's lives, I don't dare to continue. I'm only willing to be a pawn. Senior Shan, you lead the team. We will listen to you. Chapter 841. Lu Xiaoyi did not decline. At this moment, it was time to take responsibility. How could there be so much hypocrisy? Line up. Great Slant Demon Blade. Great Slant Demon Blade. Foundation Establishment Sword Formation. It was not that Lu Xiaoyi was deliberately showing off, but the sophisticated and high-end sword formations were useless on the chessboard of heaven and earth. The final battle would be a one-on-one fight, and it was impossible for a group fight to occur. Therefore, the various subtleties of the high-end sword formations were not used at all. On the other hand, the Foundation Establishment Swordsman's sword formation was only an appearance. It relied more on the external formation to display its sharpness, which was very suitable for the current situation. The Great Slant Demon Blade, also known as the Full Moon Scimitar, had an exaggerated curve. When it was sharp enough to cut through the opponent's body, it could ensure that it would pass through the opponent's body without getting stuck inside. To put it simply, the blade would never sink in, get stuck, and be unable to be pulled out. In other words, it maintained the flexibility and speed of the blade. To them, there were less than 50 people. Once they were trapped, it would be hard to say how many of them could escape. The swordsman quickly lined up on both sides of Lu Xiaoyi. This time, he was not the arrowhead, but the sharpest point in the middle of the scimitar. When he swung the blade at the enemy, it would be the point that would cut the deepest. The swordsman's formation was a little bumpy. Everyone wanted to be the blade, and did not want to be the backstabber. Lu Xiaoyi announced the rules. Once the scimitar is swung, regardless of the outcome, it must be rotated, slanting rotation, with me as the center/forward. I will say the same thing. My formation will not wait for anyone. If you can't keep up, then you better pray for yourself. Everyone knew that the rotation was mandatory, so they stopped fighting. The formation was quickly formed. Feng Qinli stood beside Lu Xiaoyi. He was still very strong. The reason why he was so slow in the first battle was because of his bad luck. He met a dragon tiger Arhut from the Bitter Zen Temple. Even so, after a tough battle, he won by a hair's breadth. When he came out and saw Lu Xiaoyi's sword wedge, he was shocked and led his people back. This was a cultivator who had a good view of the big picture and was very open-minded. However, he was a little anxious now. Senior Brother Shan, should we reorganize the formation while we move? The main Arhut formation is still moving towards the anti-Arhut formation. 7 colors and Little Zhong Mountain can't hold on. If the distance between us and them, we might not be able to catch up. Lu Xiaoyi smiled. It's fine. I have my own plans. His gaze swept across the entire battlefield. The Sword Vein Alliance's situation was not optimistic. On the left flank, the main swordsman force of 700 people and 2 reserve teams had already been deployed. Only the elite assault team had not joined. With such a numerical advantage, they were evenly matched with the anti-Arhut formation of 500 people. They had only advanced to the center of the anti-Arhut formation before they could no longer move forward. They were already beginning to show signs of fatigue. As the saying goes, the first drum is the most vigorous, the second will be the weakest, and the third will be exhausted. Sword cultivators were strong in the first 3 axes. If they couldn't take down the first 3 axes, then it would be a fool's dream to expect them to break out in the later stages. Fighting for the second half of the battle had always been the specialty of Buddhism and the Dharma lineage. Liu Xiaoyi had different opinions about the sword vein leaders forming an elite assault team. The result now was that the front line was unable to take down the enemy. They were unable to push forward. It was obvious that they lacked a sharp knife. In the end, there were 36 of the sharpest knives at the back. No one could use them to their full potential. If they could not find the position of Bitter Zen's flag in the end, what was the use of such an arrangement other than weakening themselves? However, he could not voice his opinions. He was not in the position, and he had not proven his strength. On the right flank, the 7-color sword sect was under great pressure as they were sandwiched between the anti-Arhut formation. They had lost more than half of their men. It was only a matter of time before they were defeated. They could only grit their teeth and hold on. On the other hand, the swordsmen of Little Zhong Mountain did not live up to their name. They were one of the 9 sword vein members. They had lost less than 30% of their men, but they were already retreating. They were not as tenacious as the 7-color sword sect, which was also one of the 9 sword vein members. Thus, after a series of battles, when the battle reached its climax, Liu Xiaoyi finally made 2 judgments. First, the Sword Vein Alliance's flag must be in Little Zhong Mountain's army. He had some understanding of the 9 sword vein in the upper realm of Zhouxian. This was because of the swordsman's nature. Among the 9 sword vein, the 7-color sword sect was only slightly below average, while Little Zhong Mountain was a first-rate sword sect. However, their current performance was completely different. There must be a reason. Courage, fearlessness, and hot-bloodedness were the characteristics of the sword vein. Without these characteristics, would a sword vein still be a sword vein? Therefore, he did not think that Little Zhong Mountain's performance was normal. What could affect their courage? Something that they relied on to survive. In this chessboard of heaven and earth, there is only one thing that could make them so cautious. That was the Sword Vein Alliance did not place their flag in the main camp. Instead, they placed it in a lone team that was responsible for restraining the enemy. This was the reason why Little Zhong Mountain did not dare to use their full strength. They were afraid that the position of their flag would be exposed, which would lead to a large-scale attack from Bitter Zen. By doing so, they could catch the enemy off guard and ensure that the main camp did not have to worry about the rear during the attack. They did not have to worry about exposing their weakness when breaking through the Great Arhut formation. However, this kind of concealment would not last long. It would not take long before the 2 sides on the left side of the main battlefield intertwined deeper. Perhaps the monks would realize this. Secondly, the Bitter Zen Temple's flag must be in the anti-Arhut formation. Its position was slightly behind the Great Arhut formation. The Sword Vein Alliance's gamble was actually correct. The problem was that they did not have the strength to break through the formation, even if they had more people. It was a choice between the 2. It was normal to bet on the right or wrong. What supported his judgment was that he could clearly feel that the number of Dragon Tiger Arhuts in the Great Arhut formation that they were restraining was significantly less. Most importantly, after several battles, they did not encounter a single Sutra preacher. For such a big event, how could a Sutra preacher not come? He did not believe it. This was not normal. Moreover, the Great Arhut formation had been firmly shifting towards the anti-Arhut formation. Apart from wanting to swallow up the main force of the Sword Vein Alliance, was it also because they were afraid that their flag would be touched by the swordsmen? Liu Xiaoyi's sword wedge had shaved off 20 to 30 monks. With such a large piece of meat, how could the monks, who were unwilling to suffer losses, retaliate so half-heartedly? If the flag was in the Great Arhut formation, The monks would definitely not tolerate the existence of a troublesome force to harass them. Therefore, his target was the tail end of the anti-Arhut formation. As for the rainbow's danger and Xiaozhong Mountain's safety, he couldn't care less about that. When a sword cultivator did things, they only cared about their goals. They wouldn't be nannies. Moreover, as long as his judgment was accurate, his team's next attack would change the direction of the entire chessboard. The danger of the rainbow and Xiaozhong Mountain would be resolved. The team behind him formed. Lu Xiaoyi whistled. "Let's go. Let your brother take you flying." Chapter 842. Lu Xiaoyi started to move outwards, but his direction was not towards the main Arhut formation, but towards the tail of the formation. The direction was not a problem. Regardless of whether he attacked the front or the tail of the formation, a mere 50 people could not attack the center. The true meaning of the Great Slant was to cut the edges, not the bones. The problem was the steps he took. It was not much, just 2 steps, but every swordsman in the Great Slant demon sword formation had taken 2 steps. What did this mean? It meant that Single-Eared had already killed at least 11 Arhats. It meant that after 1 or 2 more small battles, they would no longer take 2 steps, but 3, 4, 5 steps. Compared to the great Arhut formations 1 step at a time, it was like a tortoise, and they were rabbits, or a flying rabbit. They finally understood what Single-Eared meant when he said that he had his own plans. They also understood why he said that he would bring them flying. Such a monstrous existence, of course, had the qualifications to say such words. Was it the carefree mask? Not necessarily, because even the carefree mask might not be able to reach such a level. The demon swords drew a beautiful arc, and their trajectory shocked everyone on the battlefield. Everyone knew that there was a monstrous swordsman hiding within. Who could block his attack? Could the Thorn Monk? The great Arhut formation was not in chaos, but the hearts of many Arhats were in chaos. When the demon swords drew close, who knew if they would have to face the monstrous swordsman? Just this point alone increased the chances of victory for every swordsman in the great slant demon sword formation. Lu Xiaoyi sang at the top of his lungs. He had endured for 400 years. From today onwards, the universe would know of his, Lu Xiaoyi's, existence. The wind rises, clouds soar. The swordsmen echoed in unison. Draw your sword and look around. Defend our homeland. The atmosphere started to get out of control. Lu Xiaoyi was very clear that if he led these people into the Arhut formation, he would be more impulsive than rational. This would not be a good thing for the swordsmen. After all, they were not him. Therefore, he needed to calm down. This was his first time leading a team, and his momentum was too much. Under everyone's anticipation, the demon head's third sentence came. "Who stepped on my foot?" The swordsmen burst into laughter. They were all smart people and understood what he meant immediately. They replied in unison, "The one who stepped on your foot was Nandang." The one in charge of the anti-Arhut formation was the Longhu Arhut Jueji. He was not the strongest among the 1,000 monks, but he was the most experienced and the oldest. The major powers valued this. He was a little worried, because the situation on the chessboard had changed. Originally, everything was under control. The operation of the 2 great Arhut formations seemed cumbersome, but in fact, it was extremely stable. To deal with an orthodoxy like the sword vein, which was easy to launch surprise attacks and move at lightning speed, it was best to exhaust their strength, especially when the overall quality of the ascetic Zen monks was superior. The battle had already fallen into the rhythm of the monk corps. The main battlefield had fallen into a stalemate. The sword vein wanted to advance, but lacked the strength to do so. All they could do was wait for the Arhut formation to launch a pincer attack. Under the suppression of the Arhut formation, all schemes and tricks would be exposed. Therefore, they did not really care about the location of the sword vein's flag. Once the swordsmen were cleared out, it would naturally reveal itself. Where else could it hide? However, those unaffiliated swordsmen who were not worth mentioning gave him a sense of pressure. This came from a cultivator's intuition. Firstly, the flexibility of the battle tactics. From a sword wedge to the bewitching moon scimitar, it told him that the person in charge of the sword formation was not constrained by the conventional rules. Secondly, the ability to move. When the entire sword formation had the advantage of speed, they were the most difficult group to predict on the chessboard. They could surprise them at any time, anywhere, in the most important direction. The key was that they could not chase after them. Up until now, the monk with the highest battle record among the two Arhut formations was the Thorn Monk. However, he had only won 5 battles in a row. He was still far from being able to lead a small group to move quickly. It was not that the Thorn Monk was not strong enough. It was because of the overall strategy of the Bitter Zen Temple. They did not need to let the Thorn Monk take the risk just to create a so-called 11 consecutive strikes. Why would they do something that only a madman would do if they could do it so easily? The Bitter Zen Temple was not careless in this battle. They only brought 3 Thorn Monks with them. They were all hidden in the anti-Arhut formation. 2 of them had already participated in the battle and were responsible for clearing out the outstanding swordsmen. One of them was left behind to guard the flag. They were originally very safe. However, now that the bewitching moon scimitar was moving towards the back of the anti-Arhut formation, there was a possibility. Did the enemy already guess the approximate location of their flag? The person in charge of the Arhut formation, his junior apprentice brother Ju Fei, also had the same doubts. Senior apprentice brother, do you need me to send someone to intercept them? This group of swordsmen's intentions are unclear. They might attack my rear formation or yours. If they see something, Zhu Ji judged. So far, we are not sure what their intentions are. If we rush to intercept them, our enemy will definitely sense it. They will put in their last attack. Although nothing will happen, it will cause chaos and increase the casualties of our apprentice brothers for no reason. What I mean is, you should not show too much concern. Send a team of less than 100 people to intercept them. I don't think it will arouse too much suspicion. The 2 of them discussed. In fact, it was just a matter of instant communication. On the other side, the Arhut formation split into a team of 80 people in the shape of a goose's wing. They blocked the path of the bewitching moon scimitar in advance. Looking at the situation, if they really collided, the scimitars would drag each other out. The change here also attracted the attention of the Sword Vein Alliance. However, they were still unable to determine what was going on. Thousands of people gathered on the chessboard. The fluctuation of spiritual vigor was chaotic. Whether it was the Sword Vein Alliance or Bitter Zen, they were trying their best to interfere with each other's communication. Therefore, they could not accurately determine the scimitar's intentions. Lu Xiaoyi did not pass on his judgment. After all, it was just a guess. If he said it out loud, it would affect the overall direction of the Sword Vein Alliance. He wanted to see it for himself first. The scimitar against the goose's wing. Relatively speaking, the curve of the scimitar was larger. The advantage was also in the hands of the faster scimitar. However, the goose's wing had the advantage of numbers. We have to do our best to eliminate this group of enemies. We have to force them to choose whether to continue chasing us or to let them go. The advantage of this is that it will reduce the pressure on the 7 Colors Alliance and Xiaozhou Mountain. It will also allow us to attack the anti-Arhut formation without any worries. If they continue chasing us, no one here is blind. They will be able to easily determine which Arhut formation Bitter Zen's flag is in. There will be a move after this. Many people might die in this duel. This is fate. I won't force everyone to risk their lives. This is not fair to cultivators. As long as we do our best, it is not a bad choice to live. Swordsmen are not afraid of death, but they are not seeking death. Chapter 843. The scimitar swept upwards while the goose wings slashed downwards. The scimitar was thin and light, while the goose wings were thick and heavy. The 2 arcs crossed each other, and sparks of life and death were ignited in the collision. The whole battle was dull and clumsy. Due to the large number of cultivators, there were not many eye-catching tactical combinations. Only this time, It was filled with the art of battle. Therefore, it attracted the attention of countless people. What the monks wanted to know was the true strength of this individual swordsman team, and who was the leader. What the swordsman wanted to know was that this was obviously not the style of Xiao Wua and Feng Bailey. Then, who was the one who took over the command of this team? In a battle like this, the best steel would definitely be used on the blade. Sparks flew everywhere as the battle dragged on. Not only the swordsmen wanted to end the battle quickly, even the Arhats were enraged. They did not delay any longer. The Buddhists also had their moments of anger. Cultivators were constantly pushed out of the heaven and earth chessboard. Some were dead, while some were barely alive. Because both sides were in a frenzy, they did not care about the rules of the battle anymore. They wanted to kill quickly to boost their morale. Therefore, the battle progressed very quickly. To the swordsmen, this was a good thing because it was exactly what they were good at. It was also the main reason why Lu Xiaoyi used the demon blade. He wanted to make this team the star of the battle and force the monks into a fast pace. This was also the foundation of his team's ultimate victory. It was impossible for him to win against 80 people by himself. It didn't matter to the Buddhists. When the monks were really angry, their brutality began to shift toward the meridians in their bodies. With the protection of the Buddhists, once the Vajra was angry, they would never do this. If their opponent was a top sword range like the Xinyuan sword sect, they wouldn't do this. The battle between the two sides was so fast that even Lu Xiaoyi did not have the time to move around in a large area. He could only quickly finish off every opponent that appeared in the goose wings formation in front of him, so that the demon blade did not have any stagnation or obstruction. This was a hot-blooded battle. The demon blade's advantage was its sharpness at the front of the formation. That was Lu Xiaoyi's position. However, the goose wings had the advantage of being balanced as a whole. When Lu Xiaoyi saw that there were no more opponents in front of him, Fiendish Blade's team caught up with him. Of the 49 people, only 37 remained. The monks were not even as good as them. 80 people and 59 people. Of course, the main difference lay in Lu Xiaoyi. Not only did the swordsmen in the demon blade formation understand this, but so did all the cultivators on the battlefield. In the distance, Gao Yang took a deep breath. Of the 80 or so swordsmen that came from the Rainbow Sect, only 30 or so were left. He didn't know how much longer he could hold on, but now he felt that the threat from the Arhat formation had lessened. Looking at the individual guest team, he had mixed feelings. The strength of this carefree mask was above that of an ordinary mask. It seemed that he didn't want to join the 7 Color Sword Sects team because he didn't want to be bound by others and listen to others' orders. He would rather form his own team. People with ability were all like this, and there was nothing strange about it. However, if this guy had shown such strength earlier, he wouldn't have minded handing over the Rainbow Sword Sects team to him. How many people did this guy kill? How many victories did he have? To be able to make the entire sword formation jump, he had won at least 11 of his previous battles. This time, he had won 7 more battles against Cleve. Then, he was now... Lu Xiaoyi didn't give his subordinates any time to catch their breaths. Once the swordsman's attack began, it would never end until the opponent collapsed. Continue. The swordsmen quickly changed positions, and those who didn't participate in the previous battle switched positions. Then, they felt as if they were flying. 5 jumps at a time. In an instant, the scimitar mercilessly swung at the monks who didn't even have time to regroup. This was Lu Xiaoyi's continuous, saturated attack strategy that relied on speed. The goal was to completely scatter them, and then, with the advantage of local advantages, cut them down bit by bit. In a battle between cultivators, speed was eternal. This time, the scimitar was still a scimitar, but the wild goose wings were no longer complete. The wild goose wings weren't tight enough. There were empty spaces inside and scattered blades outside. With this contact, the situation immediately changed. Lu Xiaoyi finally had the chance to clear out the unyielding monks. What left everyone dumbfounded was that although the monks still had the advantage in numbers, the situation was turning hopelessly in favor of the sword cultivators. The true strength of the Moon Demon Scimitar came in the second and third slashes, until the final scimitar became a cleaver. In the second contact, the monks had shrunk down to 36 people, while the swordsman was left with 29 people. The gap was shrinking. Following, that was the third slash. This time, the monks had no formation to speak of. The wild goose wings had long disappeared, and their positions were scattered. With a charge, they immediately collapsed, and there was no way to save them. This was the first time that the swordsman had won a local battle in a situation where Bitter Zen had the upper hand in the overall situation of the heaven and earth chessboard. It indicated something that made people ponder. Seeing the remaining 20 or so swordsmen once again form the demon scimitar and rush towards the rear of the anti-Arhut formation. The meaning behind it was thought-provoking. The leaders of the Sword Vein Alliance quickly reached a consensus to mobilize the elite commandos to continue attacking the left flank. They weren't mediocre people, and they could tell that among the two Arhut formations, the one most likely to hide the flag was the anti-Arhut formation that they were attacking. The only thing they couldn't do was attack deep enough. At the same time, Bitter Zen Monk also reacted. When the Sword Alliance's last reserve team entered the battle, they were also certain that the Sword Alliance's flag wouldn't be on the left flank. Because if it was on the left flank, they wouldn't dare to attack so recklessly. Where else could it be? The Seven-Color Sword sect had already been beaten to a pulp, and the lone swordsman had taken the initiative to attack. It could only be hiding in the group of Xiaozhong Mountain that had been acting so wretchedly. The battle situation suddenly sped up. The Sword Vein Alliance's left flank launched a frenzied attack. This time, they were going all out, and they wouldn't give up until they broke through the formation. Zhufei's main Arhut formation sent out 200 people to surround Xiaozhong Mountain, while the remaining cultivators and the anti-Arhut formation merged together to defend against the Sword Alliance's attack. It was a competition to see who could capture the position of the other party's flag faster. The situation became chaotic. Whether it was Bitter Zen's Arhut formation or the Sword Vein Alliance's attack formation, they were no longer as tight as before. A large number of empty spaces appeared in the formation. This was also the result of a large number of people being exhausted after a long battle. At this point in the battle, both sides only had about 1,000 people. Bitter Zen still had about 700 people left, and the swordsman was even worse, with only about 400 people left. Chapter 844. Lu Xiaoyi led the sword-bewitching blade formation as fast as lightning. The overall situation had been stirred up, and he didn't have much time left. Without him and the sword-bewitching blade's interference, the Sword Vein's forces were like euthanasia. No matter how hard they tried and how tragic they were, the obvious difference in their strength made their efforts go to waste. This situation might have been better if they were in a normal battle space, but in a chess piece space, the swordsman's wide range of swords had completely lost the support of the environment. This made their battle seem dull, more like a positional battle. At least there was still a chance. However, Lu Xiaoyi was not optimistic about the Sword Vein's final assault. He believed in himself more. This was because he now had the maximum movement speed of 30 squares. He gave his final order to the 21 swordsmen behind him. Everyone, today, it is my honor to be able to fight alongside all of you. However, I will not be leading you from now on because time does not allow for it. I have to go in alone. You do not have my movement speed on the chessboard, so I am very sorry. The swordsmen were dejected. They knew that their leader already had the maximum movement speed on the heaven and earth chessboard. 30 squares was not something they could surpass, no matter what, not to mention the ability to survive in a chaotic battle. Their leader might have it, but they definitely did not. If he were to bring them along and do a 5-grid jump, the Arhut formation would not have enough space to accommodate them. Secondly, they would be a hindrance to their leader in the encirclement. In this kind of situation, it was actually more flexible for one person to charge into the midst of a magnificent army than for 20 people to charge in. We can harass you from the outside and reduce the pressure on you, one of the swordsmen suggested. Lu Xiaoyi smiled and said, "That is what I wanted to say. Everyone has their own responsibilities. I will not interfere with what you do outside, because I believe that you will make the best choice for the sword vein. However, this is not the time to sacrifice your life. There is no need for that. There are still many things you need to do to preserve your lives. Don't think that I will die if I rush into the Arhut formation. Let me tell you the truth. When I encounter a situation that I can't resist, I will retreat without hesitation." The swordsmen each had their own thoughts. As for what they would choose in the end, it was not up to him to decide. If they had to die for the so-called sword heart, no one would be able to stop them. He turned his gaze to the anti-Arhut formation, carefully pondering the next possible landing spot. When the anti-Arhut formation was strict, there were very few empty spaces in the formation. If he wanted to step in, he could only choose a space with an Arhut monk. He had to go through a battle first before he could observe if there were any traces of military chess within the 7 spaces of the space. The current situation was that the battle was coming to an end, and a large number of cultivators had been eliminated. The chessboard seemed very empty. Whether it was the Arhut formation or the Sword Veins Assault formation, they were much less dense than at the beginning of the battle. In other words, there was a possibility of directly entering the empty space. It was not that he was afraid of death and did not want to fight. It was just that there was no need to engage in meaningless battles. He had already increased his kill count to the maximum allowed by the rules. The most important thing now was how to fight for the military flag. There was no time for him to observe more carefully. This was because the less than 70 swordsmen from Xiaozhong Mountain were having a hard time defending the right flank under the siege of nearly 200 Arhats. They had changed their weak facade and were now fighting for every inch of land. However, their disadvantage in numbers and quality made it impossible for them to change the outcome. They could only try their best to stall for time and hope that their comrades would be able to remove the enemy's military flag before they threw it away. While the anti-Arhut formation was secretly adjusting to deal with the enemy behind them, Devil Blade was still 10 spaces away from the end of the formation. Lu Xiaoyi took a step forward and stepped into the empty space of the Arhut formation from 25 spaces away. Before he could carefully observe the surroundings to see if there were any military flags, the space around him sank. Someone had already entered his space. It was different from Chinese chess and the rules of Lu Bo. In army self-moving chess, there was no such thing as who would make the first move. It was an equal battle environment. As soon as the monk entered the space, the Buddha's light around him shone brightly. A Buddha with precious light appeared behind him. He cast the seal of fearlessness and cast the glazed light. He chanted the world-crossing scripture and Sanskrit chants. However, there were some discordant sounds, which were the countless shrill cries. Those were the cries of swords. The monk's movements were fast and smooth. Lu Xiaoyi was even faster. This was not the time to greet him. Hundreds of sword gleams gushed out and whizzed over, mixing with the clear sound Buddhist chants, appearing strange and chaotic. The Buddha with precious light transformed into countless rays of light. As the precious light rotated, the countless sword rays disappeared without a trace. Then, hundreds of sword rays appeared again. This time, it was even denser and more urgent. The Buddhist chants became more hurried, and the sword rays became more intense. It was a simple matter of endurance. The monk could clearly sense the swordsman's location. This cannot be hidden from him in the chess piece space. Both of them had equal rights in this space. He chose to defend himself with the Buddha, which meant that he would lose the initiative to attack. This was a choice between two. It was impossible to have the best of both worlds. This empty space was very conspicuous and had an excellent position. If someone wanted to rush in and observe the information of the flag in this chess piece space, this was one of the few places they could choose to do so. Although the swordsman chose this empty space and there were no monks within 3 spaces of it, what did it matter? He was also a powerhouse who had defeated 9 swordsmen and had the ability to move 5 spaces. In the upper realm of Zhou Xian, Jindan, the Thorn Monk had always been known for his strength. He was even stronger than the preacher of 10,000 Buddhas. If it was any other opponent, he would have crushed them instantly. The light from the treasures would have turned into various Buddhist weapons and rained down from the sky. The swordsman's flying swords were nothing to him. In less than 10 breaths, the entire chess piece space would have been filled with Buddhist light and Buddhist chants. What could a few sword plates do? However, this swordsman was different. He had already surpassed the upper limit of the chessboard of heaven and earth. How could he be weak if he could achieve this? Among the senior monks who came to the war chess, everyone had doubts about the person who was in charge of the Devil's Blade. The swordsman's orthodoxy was indeed very sharp and powerful, but it depended on who he was compared to. He was just trying to pick a general out of a bunch of dwarves. For thousands of years, the extraordinary people in the upper realm of Zhou have been divided by the 9 great sects. However, they had never heard of any outstanding swordsman. Cultivators were not radishes that could be developed in a few months. To Jin Dan cultivators like them, hundreds of years of accumulation, especially swordsmen who needed to be sharpened through countless battles. How could he remain unknown? They did not doubt the strength of this swordsman, but whether or not he was a swordsman. The battle in the chess piece space could not be seen. What if he was a Taoist disciple in disguise? Taishan Zhonghuang's On Boots, Qingwei Immortal Sex Tianguan, Xiao Yao Yu's Xiao Yao Mask, Huangting Taoism's Abstention, Wan Yan's Life Seed, Yuan Shi Dongzhen's Cowherd, Human Sex Tattooed Head, Daoist Cunning. All of them were possible. Chapter 845. This was the common judgment of everyone. Once they found out that there were Taoist disciples among them, they would have broken the rules, and Buddhism would no longer have to abide by certain rules. Under the lightning, what could these sword-vein disciples do to Bitter Zen Temple? They could gather Jin Dan cultivators from all over the world, but how could they gather Yuanying cultivators? How could they gather perfected cultivators? That was why he used the classic move against Dharma vein cultivators. He knew that Dharma vein cultivators could withstand the attacks of Buddhists. Against such an expert, it was unrealistic to think of a quick victory. When the sword whistled, he realized that he was wrong. This was really a swordsman, a pure swordsman. Not only did he have a flying sword, he also had the crown jewel of swordsman skills, sword ray division. The sword ray division was unimaginable. Regardless of quantity or quality, it far exceeded his understanding of the swordsman's abilities. The pressure was suffocating him. Forget about counterattacking. It was hard to say if he could even survive this round. If he knew that he would be facing such an opponent, he would not have chosen such an opening. Baoguang Buddha was stable and balanced in both offense and defense, but it was not suitable to fight against a top swordsman. In fact, he had another method that was more effective against such aggressive cultivators. Although he did not dare to say that he was confident, it was still better than being passive and having the initiative in the hands of others. The sword ray was still increasing. Amidst the despair of Thorn Monk, he felt that his Buddhist energy was leaking out madly through the Baoguang Buddha. If he did not do so, he would not be able to withstand the sword ray's invasion. Glaring Vajra. This was a unique Buddhist technique that could unleash one's potential. He did not dare to use it easily, but now he was forced to use it. He thought clearly. If this was not enough to withstand the sword ray's attack, he would admit defeat and be eliminated. With hundreds of years of cultivation and countless battle experience, he knew how terrifying a swordsman with this ability was. There was no need for him to take the risk. If he did not do well, he might even lose the chance to admit defeat. At this moment, the sword ray suddenly stopped. The storm stopped, and the intensity was no longer intense. What happened? Had the swordsman reached his limit, or was there some other reason? Thorn Monk did not have time to think. He hurriedly retracted the potential that he was about to unleash. It was best to use this forbidden power as little as possible. Just as he retracted his attack, a silent shadow had already attacked him from behind, leaving behind a trail of blood. Others would try to assassinate him in the dark when they were in a hurry, but he was also guarding against this. However, this swordsman was the exact opposite. How treacherous! It was too late for him to admit defeat, and his chances of survival were already cut off. A dazzling blood-red go piece appeared in the bright yellow Arhut formation. Everyone knew what this meant, but the monks knew even better. One of their bramble monks had been defeated, and it was unknown whether he was dead or alive. The monks surrounded him. Among them, there were even some who could jump 3 squares at a time. At this moment, Lu Xiaoyi spread out his divine perception. There were no flags of the ascetic Zen within 7 squares. However, in the direction of Xiaozhong Mountain, the flag of the sword vein appeared. In the next moment, Lu Xiaoyi appeared outside of the 18 squares. This was the position that he had calculated beforehand. In fact, the depth of the Arhut formation was very limited. There were only a few hundred people. Excluding the area where the swordsman and the 7 squares of vision where the flag was, there were not many places that could be explored. Although he had failed the first time, he was confident that he would succeed the second time. This time, he had 2 or 3 pawns at his feet. He was too lazy to care if there was anyone there or who it would be. However, it was very likely that the thorn monk would come looking for trouble. None of that mattered anymore. He was now racing against time. It was a gamble. The place where he landed was an ordinary Arhut. He wanted to stop him, but he was powerless. After a few breaths of time, the other Arhut beside him began to hesitate. This was a demon who had killed countless people. Even the thorn monk could not stop him. If he went up, he would be doomed. Lu Xiaoyi floated out of the go-pea space. It was strange that no other thorn monk came looking for him. Maybe it was because the distance was too far, or maybe it was because there were not many thorn monks, or maybe it was because they left their precious forces near the flag. He did not care too much about that. He scanned the 6 squares again. There was a particularly conspicuous go-pea space. It seemed like there was no one there, and the aura was mysterious. What about Xiaozhong Mountain? He was not in the mood to care. To him, the only thing he could do now was to give it his all. Whether he won or lost, he could only leave it to fate. When the Arhut beside him finally made up his mind and was about to stop him, Lu Xiaoyi smiled brightly and disappeared. In the 6 squares, it was a very ordinary area. There were a few go pieces wandering around. However, when Lu Xiaoyi landed on one of the go pieces, the situation immediately changed. The left wing of the main attack. No matter how tough the swordsmen were, they knew that they were on the verge of defeat. With their current situation, there was no way they could go back to Xiaozhong Mountain. It was too far. The swordsmen were only attacking mechanically. Even if they lost, they would persevere until the end. They would not admit defeat. This was not a problem of strategy or direction. It was a problem of strength. 9 unorthodox swordsman teams challenging a single Buddhist vein. The result was almost certain. If they could win like this, they would not be worthy of being a sect. How would they be able to stay on the sacred mountain for hundreds of thousands of years? From a moment they challenged Xiaozhong Mountain a few months ago, they knew the result. However, they had to do it. This was a problem of attitude. Amidst the conflict and anger, a red light suddenly rose from the bottom corner of the right wing. In the red light, a large flag fluttered in the wind. Every cultivator on the Go board could see it clearly. That was the blood flag of the Sword Vein Alliance. It had been occupied. Gao Yang and the others were ashen-faced. They had lost their momentum. What could they do? On the contrary, the monks were chanting the Buddha's name in a resounding voice. Although victory was expected, the process was indeed bloody. The Sword Vein's resistance had also caused Bitter Zen to pay a heavy price. However, the chanting Buddha's name was still lingering in the air. The Go board of heaven and earth shook again. This time, it was at the tail end of Bitter Zen's anti-Arhut formation. Similarly, a large flag fluttered in the wind. Its bright yellow color was not inferior to the blood flag at all. This time, it was the swordsman's turn to cheer. Although many people were not sure who had occupied Bitter Zen's flag, it was not important. What was important was that they had to support their comrades immediately. Bitter Zen's flag was right in front of them. The closest flag was less than 10 meters away from the vanguard. What reason did they have to retreat? Both sides had seized the flag at the same time. Now, they were competing on how to defend the flag. Whoever could defend the flag 3 times would be the final victor. If they wanted to defend the flag, they had to have the support of their comrades within the range of the enemy's flag. Otherwise, who could withstand 3 consecutive 5-on-1 battles? Chapter 846. As soon as Lu Xiaoyi entered this space, he could feel the vastness of this space. It was much larger than the average chess piece space. Perhaps it was to accommodate more cultivators in this space. In the center of the space, a bright yellow flag was erected. It was infinitely high, as if it had pierced through the ceiling of the space. At one corner of the flag, a smear of blood appeared and slowly spread to the surroundings at a speed visible to the naked eye. It was obvious that when the blood completely occupied the bright yellow flag, it would be the moment of victory. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. When he entered the space of the military flag, he saw that the blood flag of the sword vein had been occupied. In other words, in terms of time, Bitter Zen was earlier than the sword vein by an instant. In other words, in the process of defending the flag, there were still endless variables. In theory, if both sides succeeded in defending the flag, then because Bitter Zen took the flag earlier than the sword vein, Bitter Zen would definitely win. No matter how hard Lu Xiaoyi tried, it would be useless. If both sides failed in defending the flag, then they would have to start all over again until they took the flag again and defended it again. The possibility of this was not high, because with the strength of the sword vein outside, the possibility of taking back the blood flag was almost zero. Not to mention taking it back, it was difficult for them to even get close to their own blood flag, because the difference in numbers was getting bigger. He could completely stain the yellow flag with blood if he defended the 3 formations, but the problem was, how stupid would the monks be to rush over and attack the 3 formations? He could definitely stall for time. All he needed to do was to surround the military flag from the outside and prevent the other sword cultivators from getting close. The situation of the sword vein was even worse, because they could not even muster enough strength to attack. Who would take the flag first? Who would fail first? Who would succeed first? Wait, Lu Xiaoyi realized that there were too many tricks in this. Even someone as astute as him could not figure them out. But one thing was clear. The monks had a much higher chance of winning than the sword vein, because they had more strength outside, and because they took the flag earlier. After spending so much effort, this was the result. It was really depressing. He leaped out of the military flag space and looked around. What he saw was worse than what he had imagined. Little Bell Mountain had been completely defeated because there was another thorn monk among the monks who attacked them. The current situation was that the main force of the left wing and the stragglers floating outside totaled only about 300 people, and most of them were attacking the anti-Arhut formation. That was to say, on the way to Lu Xiaoyi's military chess space, there were only 6 squares left. However, these 6 squares were like a natural moat. The monks who rushed here did not give way at all. They were like a meat grinder, constantly bringing the cultivators on both sides to death. The last swordsman was the thorn monk and the rest of the dragon tiger Arhats. With their strength, even if these charging swordsmen were to sacrifice their lives, they would not be able to reach the flag. In fact, this was the choice that the remaining swordsmen had to make. They were too far away from their own flag and had no way to save it. They could only attack the Bitter Zen army flag that was close at hand, hoping to lend him a hand. The problem was, even if they managed to protect Lu Xiaoyi, in terms of time, they would only be faster than the Buddhists by an instant. What was the point? It was just a battle of wills. This was too cruel. They had already seen hope, but it was getting further and further away from them. There was nothing crueler than this. So many swordsmen had fallen on their way to help him. This made him very sad. Things should not be like this. There must be a way that he did not think of. The monks were very cunning. They did not even care about their flag being taken away. They knew that the swordsman was a monster with frightening combat strength. If they wanted to attack, they would need 2 thorn monks and 4 dragon tiger Arhats. If they only sent 6 normal Arhats in, they would not be able to return. Thus, they might as well not go in. They only sent 3 thorn monks. One died under Lu Xiaoyi's sword. One attacked the flag of the sword vein of Xiaozhong Mountain, and one stayed behind to block the main force of the sword vein of the sword vein. None of the thorn monks could come up with such numbers. Thus, they might as well let it be. After all, the Buddhists would win in the end. They could also take advantage of the situation to kill more stubborn swordsmen. What a good plan. He could not persuade them. Even if he tried, no one would listen. The swordsmen would not watch their comrades shoulder the burden alone, while hundreds of them stood by the side and watched. Even the individual swordsmen from the bewitching sword formation were rushing over. Without Lu Xiaoyi leading them, they were like a bunch of snails. But even if they were crawling, they were still crawling on the path. After the chessboard of heaven and earth, how many of these people would be left? He did not dare to think about this question. Lu Xiaoyi's mind raced. Suddenly, an idea came to his mind. The rules of the chessboard did not stipulate that the flag space could not be moved. Since there were no rules, then it was worth a try. Furthermore, regardless of whether it was the movement of the Arhut formation or the movement of the Xiaozhong mountain troops, the flag space had followed them. There was no reason why it could not be moved after it was taken away. Just do it. With a thought, he jumped 10 times, but there was no movement. The power of the rules made him unable to move an inch. Too much. Lu Xiaoyi slowed down his steps. 7 steps, 5 steps, 3 steps, 1 step, but still he did not move an inch. However, he was a stubborn person. His intuition told him that the flag could be moved. It was just that he had not found the trick to it. Since he could not think of anything outside the flag space, he returned to the flag space. There was nothing inside the space except for the huge bright yellow flag. Now, a small corner of the flag was filled with blood. At first glance, such a huge thing was formed by the power of the chessboard of heaven and earth. It was impossible to pull it out, right? However, he still wanted to try. He reached out his hand and straightened his back like a willow tree. But there was no movement. Thinking about it, when old Lu pulled up a willow tree, he first shook it a few times and knocked it a few times to shake its foundation. Then, he tried to do the same. The result was obvious. With his strength, he was nothing in front of the power of heaven and earth. Novels were not reliable. He had to use the methods of cultivation. This time, he focused his attention on the small patch of blood on the flag. That was the symbol of the sword vein. When his spirit entered it, he could feel the majestic, murderous intent surging towards him. Even with his strength, he could not withstand it. However, at this moment, he had an idea. With a roar, his whole body emitted a sharp, murderous aura. It was also the aura of the chessboard of heaven and earth. It was a gift from the white-browed old man. However, that time, it was under the white-browed old man's control. This time, he took the initiative to communicate with it. He felt that his murderous intent was growing continuously, as if it had experienced the accumulation of hundreds of thousands of years of killing on the chessboard of heaven and earth. Tens of thousands of years on the chessboard of heaven and earth was just a moment. Under the influence of his Tao of slaughter, which was growing stronger and stronger, the bright yellow flag was finally pulled up inch by inch. Chapter 847. Gao Yang's eyes were bloodshot. Up until now, the 7-color sword sect had only 26 out of 83 people who had entered. The other sects were only slightly stronger than the 7-color sword sect. Little Zhong Mountain was almost completely annihilated, so the number of swordsmen left on the chessboard was only slightly more than 200. When the monks used their core strength to form a defensive line, the Thorn Monk and Longhu Arhut's strong defense made it difficult for the swordsmen to advance. Gao Yang, Chuan Do, Mo1, and the other leaders were silent. The other leaders of the sword vein were long gone. It wasn't that the 3 of them were stronger than the others, but that their luck was better and they didn't encounter any unshakable monks. As for whether they should continue to persevere, they couldn't express their opinion, because their opinions were meaningless and couldn't change the situation. There was no hope in fighting, and they couldn't achieve any goals. Retreat. What was the point of this game? Was it just for the sake of a weak finish? Now, Every swordsman only had one reason to fight, and that was for peace of mind and for their own perseverance. After fighting for such a long time, countless of their comrades had left them. The only thing they could do was to fight with all their might, just like their comrades who had left. When the battle lost its goal, it became numb, and it also lost its passion. Chuan Do sighed. We can't help him anymore. The other two were speechless and didn't know what to say. To a swordsman, if you couldn't defeat your enemy, even if you gave up your life, the impact on your state of mind would be fatal. Just as the three of them were in a daze, a new change occurred on the chessboard. The heavens and the earth shook, and everyone was at a loss. However, they felt that the center of the shaking was where the flag was. The bright yellow flag started to sway left and right, as if someone was shaking it underneath, like a child shaking a jujube tree full of fruits. In the next moment, the bright yellow military flag fell and straightened again. The 10,000 feet tall flag had already been lifted up by someone. In the next moment, even with the flag, the person had already moved 20 feet away, completely escaping the range of the Buddhist Arhat formation. There was also an arrogant laughter. I'm riding my little motorcycle. No more traffic jams. Stop him. Surround him. Don't let him escape. The voices of the monks rose and fell one after another. The battle on the left flank had come to an end. Without this banner, the sword veins attack would have lost its target, and the monks' iron wall defense would have been meaningless. Under the command of the presiding monk, the Arhats split into several teams and chased after their own flags. This kind of situation seemed to have never happened in history, and they were completely confused about how to deal with it. However, one thing they were very clear about was that if this flag was allowed to sway all over the chessboard, it might really cause something to happen. Therefore, they still had to block it. However, his legs were too short to block it. Dozens of monks with fast movement speed had already begun to chase after him. Among them, the fastest monk, Thorn Monk, could already move 9 squares in one go. However, this speed paled in comparison to the flag. It was impossible for them to keep up. Emoan shouted, Quick, quick, quick! Get into formation and form a circular defensive stratagem. Once we are in formation, the military flag might run back. Then we can be with the military flag. Gao Yang also shouted, Move to the border. The arc stratagem is the most secure. We can avoid attacks from one side. The change was sudden. The basis for their reaction was that after their crimson flag had been snatched away by the monks, there had been 2 swordsmen from Little Zhong Mountain who had tried to take it back. Of course, they had not succeeded, but it could be considered as a capture of the flag. However, after bitter meditation's yellow flag had been snatched away, no monks had entered. If they could maintain this situation, would the heaven and earth chessboard take this into consideration when determining the outcome? Everything was a mess. Since the appearance of the devil knife and the one-eared ear, all the changes had become confusing. They did not take the usual path, and many situations had occurred that had not been explicitly stated in the rules. This was good, as there was still a chance. Their hope was to find a corner and defend to the death, waiting for the yellow flag to run back into the formation on its own. The possibility of this idea succeeding was very high, as the military flag would not run away on its own. The key was that the person running with the flag below was their comrade, a swordsman. The small motorcycle ran very fast. The movement speed of 20 squares was something that none of the monks present could compare with. Yes, the movement speed of 30 squares had been reduced to 10 squares because of the military flag. The large motorcycle had now become a small motorcycle. However, it did not matter. A small motorcycle was still a motorcycle. The strongest monk among the monks, the Thorn Monk, had only won 17 matches and could only move 9 squares. His speed was half of the original, and he could only follow behind and eat *T. As he ran, he observed the situation on the chessboard. The monk's pursuit was within his expectations, and he was also well aware of the swordsman's intentions. Nearly 200 people shouted together, Here, here. How could he not understand their intentions? However, he did not go there. He would defend to the death. Then he would watch as the swordsmen beside him fell one by one. In the end, victory or defeat would be decided by the heaven and earth chessboard. He felt that he could do the rest on his own. Perhaps he had other better and more interesting ideas? At this point, with his personality, how could he follow the rules? Of course, he would do whatever he wanted. Do whatever he wanted and cause trouble. Just treat it as a game. He circled around the chessboard. From the looks of it, he wanted to shake off the monks and wait for the swordsman's sword formation to form before circling back. This was also the opinion of everyone present. Therefore, even the 10 strong monks from Xiaozhong Mountain chased after him, hoping to intercept him. At least, they could not let him run too casually. Among them, the third monk, the Thorn Monk, was included. However, his movement speed was only 5 squares. It seemed that he had not experienced many battles. Compared to the Thorn Monk behind Lu Xiaoyi, who could move 9 squares, he was much weaker. There were also people who understood. The Thorn Monk, who could move 5 squares, had just chased after him for 15 squares. Under the control of the Arhut formation, Zhu Fei was already flustered and exasperated. Don't leave the flag. He can also take the blood flag. Too late. The moment the Thorn Monk stepped out of the last 5 squares, he was only 4 squares away from the motorcycle. Lu Xiaoyi smirked. His body flashed, and he, along with the yellow flag, had already inserted himself into the space of the blood flag. There was also a dragon tiger Arhut guarding the space of the blood flag. However, with his strength, how could he block the ferocious sword lunatic? After finishing off the dragon tiger Arhut, he began to pull out the blood flag. He had already experienced it once. Moreover, the blood flag was different from the yellow flag. The majority of the blood flag was blood red. It was the same color flag. Pulling it out was easy. During this time, another Arhut monk risked his life to stop him, because the main battlefield was too far away. The monks knew that the battle would not spread here. Therefore, the monks' defense of the blood flag was not tight enough. Now, it was time for them to suffer the consequences of their negligence. This did not pose a threat to Lu Xiaoyi at all. When he finished off this ordinary Luohan monk and popped his head out, he discovered that the dozen or so fast-moving monks from Little Zhong Mountain were rushing back. The closest Thorn Monk was only 4 squares away from him. It was only a step away. He laughed out loud. I'll ride my little motorcycle. There will be no more traffic jams. He was already 10 squares away, carrying 2 large flags on his shoulders. He was incomparably flashy. Chapter 848. He only managed to jump 10 squares. There could only be one reason. Because he was carrying another flag, his movement was restricted by another 10 squares. The motorcycle had turned into an electric car. Luckily, he had 1 more square than the Thorn Monk, so he could still run. In a war, there was never a single person who could decide everything. Even the small fry could shine. Every single person was indispensable. Looking at the leader who was carrying 2 large flags and playing hide and seek with the monks in the distance, he was having a hard time hiding. Song Rong came to the Sword Vein hosts. Senior brothers, I have something to say, and I'll have to say it. Gao Yang replied, Speak. Song Rong said anxiously. 2 points. First, Senior Shan has no intention of returning to the sword stratagem. If he wanted to return, he would have done so long ago. Moreover, there are already monks in front of our sword stratagem. He can't do it now, unless he wants to force his way in, but once he does, there will be chaos. Second, Senior Shan's movement is 30 squares when he's alone. Carrying a flag would only give him 20 squares. Now that he's carrying 2 flags, he's restricted to 10 squares. I'm afraid this is the rule of the chessboard of heaven and earth. No one can change it. Chuando squinted his eyes. This individual swordsman was very observant. What do you mean? Song Rong said, There's already a Thorn Monk who can move 9 squares. In other words, he has won 17 matches in a row. Or 18. If I let him react and beat me again in 1 or 2 rounds, he would also have the ability to move 30 squares on the chessboard. When that time comes, Senior Sean won't be able to escape. Even if he hides in the sword stratagem, he'll still be penetrated. Therefore, I suggest that all of us swordsmen admit defeat and leave, not giving the Thorn Monk a chance to attack. We have to make a quick decision. By the time the bald monk recovers, it'll be too late for regrets. Golden Elixir Realm cultivators were sharp and decisive. They would not dilly-dally. Gao Yang, Chuan and Mo looked at each other and nodded. This was the last chance and also the most reasonable method. If they could not do it themselves, then they would hand it over to the strongest person. Within the sword formation, a shrill sword whistle began to ring. That was the highest level signal for everyone to retreat. Immediately, the order was very sudden. Those who were stupid might not be able to understand it, but how could those who could form Jean Dam be stupid? A strange phenomenon appeared on the chessboard of heaven and earth. The groups of swordsmen disappeared without a trace. No one hesitated, because their existence was likely to give Bitter Zen and Thorn a chance. However, the other two swordsmen could not hear him. This was because they were fighting in the chess piece space. Gao Yang and the other two were the last three. They hoped that they could spread the news when their companions came out. At the same time, they stared at the Thorn Monk. As long as he dared to come within the range of the 9 squares, they would immediately admit defeat and leave. They can also send someone else to hold us back first. Mo sighed. Whoever gets entangled will admit defeat. We can afford to lose face like this. Chuan said resolutely. What if they admit defeat the moment they enter? Gao Yang was very comprehensive. 9 slots isn't safe. Let's go. We can only leave the rest to fate. The three of them no longer hesitated and disappeared from the battlefield. At this moment, the monks finally understood. Zhu Ji asked the Thorn Monk, Zhu Yuan, how many rounds have you won? 18. Zhu Yuan was a little confused. A glimmer of hope appeared in Zhu Ji's heart. All right, you don't have to chase after that swordsman now. Go and guard the remaining 2 battle spaces. If the swordsman wins, you will attack. I will tell the others not to attack. Bitter Zen still had a chance. As long as Zhu Yuan could win another round, he would gain 30 slots of super long-range movement. Then, the swordsman would not be able to escape. As long as Zhu Yuan could hold him back once, even if he lost in the end, it did not matter. Now, only Bitter Zen was left in the chessboard of heaven and earth. As long as they surrounded him within 10 squares, how many rounds could the swordsman last? 10? 20? There were hundreds of Luohan monks here. Even if he was tired, he would die of exhaustion. Zhu Ji had never hoped so. He hoped that the final winner of the battle would be the swordsman and not one of them. The swordsman's overall strength was not as good as theirs. He only needed one. Zhu Ji's heart skipped a beat. Beside him, Zhu Fei said, Senior, there's another problem. The 2 battle spaces are quite far apart. Zhu Yuan can only guard one. Zhu Ji thought for a moment. Send people to surround the other battle space. As soon as he comes out, attack immediately. But don't win after he enters. Drag it out until the end and then surrender. Buy time for Zhu Yuan. Zhu Fei nodded and added, We can't stop attacking that swordsman. We have to force him to move around so that he won't have a chance to speak. Also, our Sanskrit chants must be heard. We must block all forms of divine sense transmission. The monks followed Zhu Ji's instructions. Zhu Yuan guarded one of the battle spaces, several Luohan guarded another, and the rest of the monks continued to chase after the swordsman. The chants of Sanskrit chants once again resounded throughout the chessboard, shaking the heavens. Lu Xiaoyi strolled leisurely in the distance. Without the pursuit of 9 squares Thorn Monk, he was in a relaxed state. He was very satisfied with what the swordsmen had done. They were not stupid enough to know that they had backed out. Not only would it make the Bramble Monk lose 30 slots of movement, it would also free up more space for his chess pieces, allowing him to jump in a wider environment. As for the remaining 2 battle spaces, he could only leave them to Tian Yi. He was not too worried because it was a fact that the swordsman was at a disadvantage in the battle. It did not make sense that they would be able to defeat the Luohan monks so suddenly. If they were that strong, they wouldn't have been forced into such a situation. There was a 60% chance that both swordsmen would lose, a 30% chance that one swordsman would win, and a 10% chance that both swordsmen would win. If the worst-case scenario happened, it would only prove that Tion Yi was not on the Sorvain side. He also had to consider whether Thorn Monk had won 17 or 18 matches in a row. There was no need to scare himself. The worst-case scenario would be a battle. What else could happen? Thorn Monk could catch him with his 30 squares of mobility. This was the first round of the rules. It was a one-on-one duel. He was not afraid. The number of people who would enter the second round would depend on the progress of his battle with Thorn Monk. If he fought quickly, he might not even be able to gather 6 people around him. The third round might be the worst, because he would be surrounded by 6 people, and they would be the strongest of the remaining swordsmen. However, he had nothing to be afraid of. There were 3 Thorn Monks in total, and he had already defeated one of them. There was only one left in the first round, which meant that the last round would at most be a Thorn Monk with 5 of the strongest Dragon Tiger monks. There was still a lot to fight. Therefore, he wanted to see which side his luck would stand on this time. He was about to turn the tables with his own strength. Unfortunately, there were no spectators, only enemies. Chapter 849. The 2 battles ended almost at the same time. Bitter Zen Monk's luck was not bad, but it was not bad either. The Arhut won the chess piece space that Thorn Monk was guarding, while the swordsman won the chess piece space that was far away. There was still a chance. It took time to move there. One of the monks had already received the order to challenge the swordsman who won the chess piece. The purpose was to prevent him from observing the situation too much. It would be troublesome if he communicated with the swordsman who was holding the flag. Nandang was very confused. The moment he got out of the chess piece space, the situation in front of him was completely different from before he entered the battle. Before the battle, the leader, Senior Shan, was holding the 2 flags proudly, and there were more than 200 disciples setting up the sword formation on the chessboard. How did they all disappear after a battle? Disappeared? Only him and Senior Shan were left on the chessboard of heaven and earth. This was not normal, very abnormal. With such a huge change, the entire victory of the Sword Vein depended on him and Senior Shan. This made him very nervous, and even the battle was a little absent-minded. What made him even more confused was that even though he was absent-minded, he still did not lose. His opponent was even more absent-minded than him. As a member of Demonic Blade's team, his admiration for his boss was unquestionable. It was only right for his boss to take on this responsibility, but it was strange that he was included. Nandang felt that his strength was not bad, but it was still at the normal level. He was not different from the other swordsmen. He did not understand why he was standing with Senior Shan at this stage of the battle. Standing at the end? They were different swordsmen. If Senior Shan was a swordsman, then he might not even be qualified to be a swordsman. The difference was too big to measure. Something was wrong, and he needed to make a judgment. This was his first feeling. It was not that he did not want to contribute to the Sorvain. If he did not want to contribute, he would not have come here. But in this situation, the direction of his contribution was definitely not because of his strength. Senior Shan was, but he was definitely not. There must be a way for him to contribute. Even if he won this battle, how many more could he win? There were also several hundred monks, Longhu Arhut, and Thorn Monk. Based on Senior Brother Shan's personality, when he was in the demonic blade sword array, he would not come to save him. Furthermore, he did not have the strength to save Senior Brother Shan. In that case, what else could he do? He couldn't kill the man. The flag was taken away by Senior Brother Shan. As for the other 200 or so senior brothers, they had all left. This was the strangest of the strangest. No matter how strong the ascetic Zen monk was, it was impossible for more than 200 swordsmen to be kicked out of the game in such a short time, unless they left on their own. And this weird Luohan monk, he could clearly sense the monk's lack of fighting spirit. If he connected all of these together, then it was obvious what he should do. Nandang laughed in his heart. This time, he must not step on Senior Brother Shan's foot. Having made up his mind, he sent out a message in his mind, "I admit defeat." In the next moment, the Luohan monk looked at the displeased Jiwen in front of him, as well as Juliao Ji and Juliao Fei in the distance. "It's not me. I didn't use any strength." He was the one who suddenly admitted defeat. Maybe he saw something. Lu Xiaoyi began to play checkers with the monks. He could jump 10 squares, Zhu Yuan could jump 9 squares, and the other monk, Thorn, could jump 6 squares. Behind them, there was a large group of monks who could jump 2, 3, 4 squares. How to not get caught was an extremely complicated mathematical problem. The good thing was that the space of the chessboard was very wide. There were nearly 10,000 chess pieces, but there were less than 500 monks chasing after him. As long as he calculated carefully, he could avoid the monks' attacks. It was not that he wanted to avoid the battle, but that there was no opponent that he was interested in. Thorn Monk's strength was not bad, but he was still far from being a threat to him. His interest now was to play with the monks and see how far they could go in the final game of checkers. There was not much time left for the ascetic Zen monk. When the 2 flags were in his hands, the changes were intensifying. The monk's yellow flag was being swallowed by the red color faster and faster. Now, half of it had turned red, and the yellow color on the blood-red flag was nowhere to be found. "I've heard of sword cultivators and was overjoyed at the prospect of a battle," Thorn Monk Wan Yuan taunted. But who would have thought that hearing about a sword cultivator couldn't compare to meeting in person? "Fellow Taoist, do you dare to stop and fight me?" Lu Xiaoyi laughed. "Monk, do you think I'm a 3-year-old kid? There are hundreds of you chasing after me. All of you want to eat my flesh and drink my blood. Now you're telling me to stop and fight with you fairly? A single fight to determine the winner and the loser is bound by a Tao oath. Do any of you dare to accept? Is Buddha's mercy so merciful? You want others to die? Are you a cat crying to a dead mouse?" Juwen kept his head down, but he refused to answer. He wanted to say yes, but he could not bear the responsibility. He knew very well that the swordsman's strength was beyond his imagination. The 3 Thorn monks were evenly matched in strength. The only one who came into contact with a swordsman was defeated on the spot. He was not that strong either. Therefore, he could not accept. He could only play checkers and hope that he could catch up to him while jumping around. As long as he could entangle this guy and drag on for a period of time in the chess battle space, the other Arhut monks would be able to surround him. To them, this was the only way to win, to clear the last sword cultivator out of the heaven and earth chessboard. Those who could run fast were chasing after the swordsman, but most of them could only run 1 or 2 squares. Under the leadership of Jueji and Jufai, they built a human wall in the middle. Their intention was simple. After the wall was erected, they would push it horizontally. Then, they would place a few monks in front of the human wall to prevent the swordsman from passing through. The heaven and earth chessboard was hexagonal. The largest width between 2 sides was 120 squares, and each side had 60 squares. The monks still had about 500 arhats. If they formed a human wall in the middle, it would be as thick as 4 rows. They did not need to line up very closely. They only needed to line up 1 row apart to control the space of 8 squares. If they placed some fast-moving monks in front of the human wall, the swordsman would not be able to pass through with his 10 squares. It was a very smart move. With the pressure of the human wall, Lu Xiaoyi could not continue playing Chinese checkers. Humans had infinite wisdom. His so-called knowledge from his previous life was useless here. Not to mention waiting for the human wall to completely close in on him. When a human wall closed in on him, the space he could move in was greatly reduced. There were a few times when he barely managed to dodge Jueji's attacks. It was only a matter of time before he was captured. This, however, piqued his interest. The monks wanted to fight. He would not. Jueji approached Lu Xiaoyi again. This time, he succeeded in pushing him to the bottom line. He was still 6 squares away from him. But because he was at the bottom of the board, no matter which direction he moved in, he would be caught by Jueji. "You want to run again? Did you lose your underwear? If I can't catch you this time, I'll change my surname to yours." Lu Xiaoyi laughed. "Don't. I don't have the money to raise a son like you. You want to see how I move?" Open your eyes and watch carefully. He inserted the blood flag from the sword vein into the chest piece space. He did not want it anymore. Then his body floated 20 squares away. This flag is not small. Cut it carefully. It's enough for each of you. Chapter 850. The monks would never have thought that this guy would have the courage to make such a choice. What was the point of giving them the blood flag? No matter how it changed color, how could it compare to the yellow flag that was already half blood red? The key was that this guy had 20 units of movement ability, so passing through the human wall was a piece of cake. Even Zhu Yuan could only touch his fart. The others could not even touch his fart. So how could they chase after him? The human wall was useless, and chasing after him alone was useless. The monks were in a desperate situation. Under Zhu Ji's signal, the monks stopped their futile pursuit. He slowly came to a spot 20 units away from the swordsman, without a single person around him. Fellow Taoist, you have shown us what a real swordsman is. This is the first time this monk has seen someone as capable as you. We cannot compare to you. However, there is nothing that cannot be discussed in the cultivation world. The chessboard is not a dark room, but it is better than one. From what I see, you are not someone from the 9 greatsword vein. You are just lending a helping hand. After all, the ownership of Wavering Shadow Little Lu has nothing to do with you right now, nor does it have anything to do with you in the future. What do you gain? But my bitter Zen temple can give you something that no one else can. Something that you can enjoy for the rest of your life, as long as you ask for it. If the hard way did not work, they would use the soft way. Well, there was not a second swordsman in this place. No one would know what he did. They saw that he was in the freelance swordsman group, so they treated him as a wandering swordsman from an unknown Little Lu. He relied on his extraordinary talent to achieve what he had today. Shouldn't he be shallow? I'm a swordsman. I want a peerless swordsmanship, at least better than what I am now. Can your sex satisfy me? Lu Xiaoyi asked. Zhu Ji was a little embarrassed. You are already so powerful, and you still want to learn swordsmanship from others? It is more likely that others will learn from you. No. Although my Buddhist sect has countless martial arts manuals, there is nothing about swordsmanship that can be taken out. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. Then, what about a peerless Dao technique? One that can directly lead to the upper realm? You can't use those Buddhists to fool me. I'm already so old. If I were to change my path to Buddhism, how would I have so much time? Zhu Ji shook his head again. No, Buddhism is Buddhism, and Taoism is Taoism. Each has its own advantages. Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. Do you have a pill that can make you have yuanying after eating it? Zhu Ji felt a headache coming on. No, if there was, I would have eaten it long ago. Lu Xiaoyi shrugged. Nothing here, nothing there. Monk, are you here to make fun of me? Zhu Ji smiled enigmatically. That's why I said you've never seen anything that can really change your fate since you're from a small town. In the eyes of ordinary people, cultivation techniques, pills, and tools are just dead things. With fellow Taoist ability, it's not impossible for you to obtain them if you work hard. However, there are some things that you can't obtain even if you work hard for a lifetime. Lu Xiaoyi said in surprise. Oh, what have I never heard of? Zhu Ji took a deep breath. For someone like him, ordinary things could not be used to entice him. Although he pretended to be greedy, that might not be the case in reality. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to cultivate to such a level. His vision must be extremely high. I've already told you. It's fate. You control your own fate. Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. Fate? Don't tell me you're talking about the Providence cluster in each of our minds. I already have it. Why do I need your charity? Besides, the sword vein is a distant branch of Taoism. I've made such a great contribution. When I go back and ask the upper sects for help, it won't be difficult for me to get some special ball of destiny, right? Why do I have to hang myself on the tree of Buddhism? Zhu Ji smiled mysteriously. That's different. What we can give you, Taoism can't. It's a fate that you can control. It's a fate that you can devour and grow. It's a fate that you can improve yourself. It's not the ball of destiny in your mind that you can't completely control. Lu Xiaoyi was puzzled. We're both upper sects. What can you give that Taoism can't? I don't believe it. Zhu Ji gritted his teeth. In order to win over this swordsman, he decided to reveal some key things. Moreover, he didn't think that these things would cause any consequences. The upper cultivators actually knew about it, but they just didn't say it. Of course, Taoism can't do it, because they don't have a carrier of faith. All right, that's all I can say. You can decide for yourself what you want to do. It's not that my bitter Zen temple can't afford to lose such a small continent. Even if we lose 10, will it shake the foundation of my bitter Zen temple? Lu Xiaoyi's heart trembled. He finally understood why the whole ball of destiny was so strange. It was because he missed out on a very important point. He only focused on the ball of destiny itself, but he didn't notice the carrier that carried the ball of destiny over long distances. The power of faith. The people of the prairie had their luck transferred away because of their messy beliefs. The land of exile had their luck transferred away because of their belief in the dragon god, who was the best at understanding beliefs in the cultivation world of this universe. If the Buddhists said they were second, no one would dare to say they were first. Suppressing the fluctuations in his heart, Lu Xiaoyi shrugged. I'm sorry. I'm not interested in illusory things. I always feel like I've been cheated. I still prefer tangible benefits. If you don't have them, then it's a pity. Zhu Ji's voice turned cold. Ba, benefactor, are you going to walk this path to the end? You have to know that although Zhou Xian is big, there's no place that the 9 upper sects can't reach. You may win this game of chess and win the shaking shadow realm, but you may also lose your future, your personal future. Is it worth it to lose yourself for others? Lu Xiaoyi laughed in a low voice. I'm a swordsman. I am, and I will be. I am in this universe. And so is that universe. You got the wrong person. Zhu Ji retreated with an ashen face. He had already decided that the next step would be to ask the temple to take revenge on the swordsman's little Lu and his orthodoxy. The bitter Zen temple would not do this personally, and it would not be easy to do so. He could not think of anyone who could pose a threat to the swordsman on Jindan's level. Even if they did not come, the most outstanding of the bramble monks might not be able to do so. But in the cultivation world, there would never be a lack of knives. One person against a power, and a power from the upper sects, would always be like a mantis trying to stop a chariot. He could withstand it, but what about the people around him? Masters? Friends? Friends? There would always be a weakness that could be exploited. When a powerful power made a move against a cultivator, you would not even be able to find a place to hide. The bitter Zen monks began their final frenzy. All 400 of them began to attack the swordsman, trying to find a loophole. This time, they were careless. But for someone who liked to play checkers and had some foundation in mathematics, especially someone who could jump 20 squares in one go like a toad, this game was simply too satisfying. I'll ride my little motorcycle. I'll never get stuck in traffic. Chapter 851. Gao Yang and the rest waited anxiously outside. There were more than 400 swordsmen standing outside. Among them, 200 had just come out, and 100 had come out with serious injuries. No one said anything. Those who died for the sword were brothers, and those who were seriously injured were also brothers. Everyone's choice was different, and no one had the right to force anyone else. Comparatively speaking, there were more than 300 ascetic Arhat monks standing opposite them. Including those who were still in the heaven and earth chessboard, there were nearly 800 survivors. 200 Buddhists had died, and 600 swordsmen had died. This number cruelly showed the huge difference in strength between the side sects and the upper sections. This was also under the circumstance that more than half of the ascetic Arhat monks had not come. At least, only 3 Thor monks had come, and most of them had their own missions. Both sides stood opposite each other, but there were no signs of fighting. The monks were because of the rules, while the swordsmen were because of their strength. This was completely different from the 5 rings. If it were Xian Yuan and his gang, this would be a good place to kill. Their ideals were different. As they waited, the news of Single Ear's identity began to spread. Every swordsman looked at the 7-color sword sect with eyes full of respect. This made Gao Yang feel like he was sitting on pins and needles. He was very hesitant. Entering the chessboard and risking his life was one thing, but coming out to take the blame was another. When the real ascetic temple began to take their revenge, how could the seven color sword sect, whose strength had been greatly reduced, withstand it? However, there was also a large group of people who understood. Chuan Do and Mo when came over. They knew very well about the seven color sword sect and knew that with the ability of the seven color sword sect, it was impossible to cultivate such a freak. The cultivation world had its own rules. It was not something that a small side sect's genius could dominate. It involved too many things, such as martial arts techniques, swordsmanship, resources, tools, pills, mysteries, and so on. Mo when suddenly asked. I suddenly remembered. About 10 years ago, the famous Jean Dan of the Seven Color Sword Sect was taken away to carry out a special mission. Right? Did he come back? Gao Yang smiled bitterly. He didn't come back. He was taken in by the sect. He also came back, but it wasn't him. Chuan Do understood. I understand. This was a top-notch expert sent by a Taoist sect. This time, these Dharma noses are quite interesting. They didn't completely sit back and do nothing. I wonder which one is it? Gao Yang whispered, masked, and Mo Wen was very surprised. I thought it was a Tianguan or a bull rider. When did Xiao Yao's mask become so powerful? Their title holders have always been the weakest among the Taoist sects. Chuan Do sneered, that's just a rumor. How can there be a proper ranking between titled ones? Pretending to be weak was nothing new in the cultivation world. That's right. Only Xiao Yao Yu's orthodoxy is more diverse, and there are quite a few swordsmen among them. I didn't expect their swordsmanship to reach such a shocking level. How can we endure this? The few of them chatted casually. The reason why Gao Yang had exposed this secret was because he wanted to use the two of them to slowly spread the news. Xiao Yao, you could take the blame for this, but the Seven Color Sword Sect couldn't. As for whether it would violate the rules, there was no need to worry. This time, the Yaoying Land's chess game was a grudge between the sword vein and bitter meditation. As long as you were a swordsman, it wouldn't be considered a violation of the agreement, even if you were a Xiao Yao swordsman or a Tai Xian Huang swordsman. Will we win? Mo Wen was very worried. Gao Yang took a deep breath. We didn't expect to win this chess game. We just wanted to show the sword vein's unyielding will. Junior brother Mo has seen hope, and his mind is in a mess. On the other side of the group of swordsmen, the individual swordsmen had also gathered together. After the battle, they were actually the group with the highest survival rate among the 11 teams. It wasn't that they didn't fight hard, but that they followed the right leader in the process of the battle. They didn't take on too important a task. As a result, from less than 90 people, there were only 50 left. The friendship of swordsmen was most precious only through living and dying together in battle. They all came from different continents. They didn't know each other before, but gathered here for a common goal. Now, they had become friends in life and death. After a simple conversation, the topic returned to the leader, Senior Brother Sean. Do you think Senior Brother Sean is from the Seven Color Sword Sect? If he is, if we join the Seven Color Sword Sect, even if we can't be as invincible as Senior Brother Sean, won't we be able to improve a little? Fei Sha asked. His question was actually a question that many people were asking, especially those individual swordsmen who had formed the Devil Blade. They respected this Senior Brother Sean as if he was a god. He carried the two flags and moved freely. This kind of carefree spirit was not something that could be faked by ordinary people. They just didn't know what the little motorcycle that Senior Brother Sean was talking about was. Che Xie shook his head. I don't think so. If he was really from the Seven Color Sword Sect, why would they send him to our individual swordsman team? With Senior Brother Shan's ability, how many fewer people would die if he stayed in the Seven Color Sword Sect? Now, Dafa would rather sacrifice more of their own to send him to protect us individual swordsmen. Also, I saw that Senior Brother Sean was in the last row at that time, and no one looked up to him. Song Rong nodded. Yes. He was right behind me. Senior Brother even stole the kill. At that time, I didn't know him. You who was in the last row, dared to act like a wolf? I was waiting for him to come out and scold him. A swordsman joined in the fun. Did you scold him? Song Rong laughed. Why didn't I scold him? Senior brother killed 3 people in a row. When he came out, I immediately scolded him. Senior brother's swordsmanship is extraordinary. Junior brother, Song Rong from Gushi. The swordsman roared with laughter. They were the group of people who had the least to worry about. They had senior brother Shan in front of them and the 9-sword vein behind them. They were just individual swordsmen. It was impossible for a large force like Bitter Zen to take them seriously. After this matter, they had done their duty as swordsmen. They could be as carefree as they could be without any burden. Nandang, on the other hand, was deep in thought. After seeing senior brother Shan's prowess, I feel that all my training in swordsmanship has been for naught. With this kind of swordsmanship, I might as well not have practiced it at all. Say, if senior brother Shan is also an individual swordsman, can we also form a sect, organization, or guild? Senior brother Shan can push senior brother Shan, and we can all learn from him? Song Rong clapped his hands. Nandang, you must have been enlightened by that back kick. That makes sense. Since we are all swordsmen, we don't have any assets to hold us back. If one of us dies, the whole family dies. Since we have nothing to do, I just want to see the true face of senior brother Shan's swordsmanship. The chessboard of heaven and earth is too boring. We only see people enter, but we don't hear the sounds of battle. It's like listening in on a bed. What's the use of just listening without seeing? Everyone laughed. This was actually everyone's wish. They were all prepared to die here. So what was there to be unhappy about? They no longer cared about the outcome of this game. They were more eager to see senior brother Shan's unfathomable swordsmanship. It made their hearts itch. Chapter 852. It was not only the ascetic Zen monks and swordsmen who were waiting for news outside. There were also many Dharma cultivators from few Taoist sections. Some of them operated the Cloud Sea flying boat, while others were in charge of healing. In fact, it was all a pretense. Their real purpose was to monitor the situation and deal with any accidents that might happen. Since they had such a mission, it was impossible for them to send ordinary people. In a flying boat in the sea of clouds, a few Taoists sat in a circle. There was the abdicator of Yellow Court Taoism, the heavenly crown of Qingwei immortal sect, the tattooed head of human sect, the life seed of Wanyan creation, the Mang boots of Taishan Middle Yellow, and the bull rider of Yuanshu Cave. They were also very surprised. Hundreds of people from a sword vein had been chased out. Only one of them was left on the heaven and earth chessboard. How could he fight with hundreds of ascetic Zen monks? Although they were happy to see the Buddhists being defeated, wasn't it a little too exaggerated? Don't forget that there were a few thorn monks inside. They were people that even they found difficult to deal with. Mang Boots smiled gently. He had heard the news. Aren't you guys curious that one of us is missing? Tian Guan reacted quickly. Carefree travel? Do you mean that the one inside is the carefree mask? Is that possible, with their ability? The prohibitionist did not think so. Don't underestimate the carefree mask's ability. These are just rumors. It has been thousands of years. It seems that we have not had the chance to determine who is better. The reason why the carefree mask is said to be weak is because they rarely appear in public, right? When Sho said in a low voice, it's exposed. Not long ago, carefree travel and 1,000 Buddhas were fighting for Shajia Little Land. It seems that the carefree mask beat up one of the 1,000 Buddha's preachers. Beat up a child? How did that happen? Life Seed was very curious. Everyone was discussing. At their level, the Buddhist preachers and the thorn monks were not easy to deal with. They were really powerful, and they had experienced it before. Therefore, they were very curious about the carefree mask. No matter what the outcome of the sword vein was, the carefree mask had made a name for himself this time. They did not know which mask it was, and if they knew him. In the midst of their discussion, they suddenly felt a change in the world. The surrounding clouds turned blood red, rolling and surging, as if a blood-red river of clouds, boundless and limitless. The screams of the swordsmen and the whistling of the flying swords continued for a long time. The people of the Bitter Zen temple did not linger. They formed a Buddhist formation and quickly left amidst the low and desolate Sanskrit chants. It was really embarrassing. The dignified upper sect was actually defeated by a few unorthodox sections. This was a major event that had not happened in thousands of years, and they had become the negative example and would be laughed at for many years. Amidst the red clouds, there was a smiling young man surrounded by the stars. His face was as bright as the sun, but he did not appear to be very outstanding. He was currently accepting everyone's congratulations and gratitude without any arrogance. The bull rider made this judgment as soon as he saw it from afar. He had an extraordinary sense of mystery. It must be the carefree mask. He's still wearing a mask. Looks like he's pretending to be a swordsman from the seven-color sword sect. The Terminator was puzzled. That's strange. Carefree Travel's mask had always kept a respectful distance from this kind of thing. Why was he so proactive this time? According to the usual practice, the six of us will fight while he sits on the flying boat and watches, right? Life Seed flicked his sleeves. There's no point in talking too much. Let's go and see what kind of hero he is to be able to defeat a lower sect alone. The environment was noisy, but it was filled with joy. The losers had left, leaving only the winner, the Sword Vein, and the Taoist behind. After the hubbub, it was quiet again. When they carefully counted their gains and losses, everyone could not help but feel sad for the price they had paid. Too many swordsman brothers had left, and it was a pity that they were in the prime of their lives. In the Sword Vein, the Shadow Sword Palace suffered the greatest loss. There were more than 200 Jindan swordsmen in the palace, but only about 10 of them were left. This was because they had been fighting at the front lines on the left side of the battlefield. This was their land. If they did not charge at the front lines, who would? None of them admitted defeat and left. In the end, there was only so much left on the chessboard. This was no longer a case of breaking bones or losing limbs, but they were only left with one last breath. It was impossible to judge if their choice was correct, but to them, they knew that they were bound to lose. They knew that they would lose the birthplace of their power, so it was understandable for them to fight to the death. Who would have thought that things would take a turn for the worse? Now that the land was protected, how to continue the legacy of the Shadow Sword Palace was another problem. How could a mere 10 Jindan continue to spread their branches and leaves in the Shadow Sword Palace? Among these 10 Jindan, with the difficulty of becoming a swordsman, there might not even be a single Yuanying. How could there be a future? This game of chess had won 500 years of blank time for the Yao and cultivators. However, there was a gap at the Jindan stage, where they could neither ascend to the heavens nor descend to the earth. In the cultivation world, what could 500 years do? At most, it could only nurture a few Jindan. The turbulent faith of the mortals, the broken ranks of the cultivation world, the covetous eyes of the Buddhists, and the unreliable support of the Taoists. All of these were just the beginning for the Shadow Sword sect. Their difficulties and tests were still to come. They were the first to leave because the land was just below them. There were too many things to do. How to distribute the manpower was also a difficult problem to solve. The second to lose was Little Zhong Mountain. They had proven their swordsmanship bloodline when they protected the military flag. Unfortunately, their skills were not as good as others. No matter how much they struggled, they could not hide the huge difference in their strength. Then it was 7 colors, Sword Wind Tower, Heavenly Shaking Mountain, Blood Snatch, etc. Big Brother and Second Brother had also lost quite a bit, more than 50%. However, they still retained at least half of the Jindan strength in their own mountains. Therefore, even though it was painful, it was not unbearable. It would not be a problem for them to recover after a few hundred years. When the crowd gradually dispersed, only a group of people remained. Lu Xiaoyi found that he was surrounded by a few dozen people who were unwilling to leave. This was very strange. Why are you all surrounding me? It's not like I'm going to treat you to a meal. Everyone fought a battle, and our friendship will last forever. However, isn't it time for us to go back to our own homes and find our own mothers? Che Xie's face was sullen. We don't have mothers, fathers, sons, or grandsons. We don't have a place to heal our wounds. We don't need it. We are all lonely people here. The domain is our home. Nandang mustered up his courage. Boss, why don't you lead us? You see, everyone is quite pitiful. There's no one to take care of them. Their skills are not good. They get bullied when they go out and have no home to return to. These words were a little too much. These people were indeed at a disadvantage against a top mountain sect like Bitter Zen. However, the domain was vast. If they were in another place and another opponent, in the region of the 3,000 unorthodox schools, these people were unreasonably tyrannical existences. How could they be pitiful? However, it was extremely difficult to learn real skills in the cultivation world. It was true that they wanted to choose a leader, but it was also true that they wanted to learn some real skills of a swordsman. It was very difficult to ask, why should others share their special skills with everyone? They could only beat around the bush. Chapter 853. Lu Xiaoyi narrowed his eyes and did not say a word. Song Rong was afraid that there would be an awkward silence. Senior brother Shan, actually, everyone saw your great power in the chessboard of heaven and earth, but they didn't see the real swordsmanship, so they were a little curious. They just want to know what kind of swordsmanship could suppress bitter Zen monk. Lu Xiaoyi smiled. Swordsmanship is used to kill, not for people to see. The individual swordsmen were a little embarrassed. It seemed that Senior Shan did not intend to form a group. Well, with his skills, where could he not go? What could be difficult for him? It was troublesome to lead a group of lonely souls, and if something happened, he had to protect them. After all, cultivation was a personal matter. Lu Xiaoyi's tone changed. But I may be going to do something next, and I may need the swordsmanship. Fei Sha was very clever. Since everyone has nothing to do, if Senior Shan doesn't mind, we would like to follow you and take a look. Maybe we can help you or something. Lu Xiaoyi smiled. That's your business. I have no right to restrict you. After a brief calculation, there were about 40 swordsmen who were willing to follow him on this trip. Basically, they had formed the Demon Moon Scimitar with him, and the rest had their own things to do. Maybe they did not want to wallow in the mire with him? About 40 lonely people who left without any worries. They really brought out the swordsman's loneliness to the extreme. Everyone landed on the ground and prepared to walk through the crack. However, they did not want to bother the Taoist sect's cloud sea flying boat. These people were well aware of the Taoist sect's role in this. They seemed to be helping them, but in fact, it was more like they were instigating trouble. If Senior Brother Shan did not appear out of nowhere, they would not have achieved their goal. From this point of view, everyone was wary of the Taoist's visit. When flying towards the crack passage of Xiaoying, Lu Xiaoyi found that there were 2 more people in the group. They had met before. 2 Taoist friends following us. I wonder, of the 2 unfamiliar Taoists, one was old-fashioned and the other was humorous. The one who answered was the old-fashioned one, Chu Tu, the prohibitionist of Huangting Taoism. Fellow Taoist, Dan has fate with my Golden Court Hall. Not only do we have fate with treasures, we have fate with people as well. I followed you because I wanted to see fellow Taoist's ability. If you're really extraordinary, then there's no need to say anything. If you've deceived the world to gain fame, then I might have to ask fellow Taoists for a few treasures. Lu Xiaoyi knew what he was talking about. You've eaten and used all the treasures. I'm sorry to disappoint you, fellow cultivator Chu. However, words have no proof. In the cultivation world, evidence is the most important thing. The other cultivator, Hishidao, the life seed of Wan Yan's creation, laughed. Fellow Taoist Dan, don't worry. We don't have any bad intentions. The trivial matter of the Golden Court Hall has already passed. Now it's just a matter of words. As for me, Xiaoying Little Land was originally a dispute between Wan Yin and Bitter Zen. We were incompetent and lost this land, causing the sword vein to suffer heavy losses. Fortunately, fellow Taoist Dan's invincible power prevented the situation from deteriorating to the point of no return. If fellow Taoist needs help, I don't mind lending a hand. Lu Xiaoyi didn't care. The purpose of these two was definitely not that simple. As they flew forward, they met Tianguan of the Qingwei immortal sect. It seemed like a coincidence, but in fact, it was intentional. When they flew to the crack entrance, several Daoist special professions had all gathered together, which made him speechless. He was very clear about the intentions of these people. They wanted to see the true strength of the carefree mask. Seeing once was better than hearing 100 times. No matter how much he had done on the chessboard of heaven and earth, they had only heard about it. Some things still needed to be observed up close. Lu Xiaoyi didn't care. Ever since he completely exposed his strength on the chessboard of heaven and earth, he knew that he couldn't hide it. There was no need for him to hide it either. After cultivating to this point, it was impossible for him to be able to hide his head and tail. As for the details of his swordsmanship, how could it be ineffective just by looking at it? Even if you look at it 100 or 1,000 times, you still wouldn't be able to block it. Among all the continents in the upper realm of Zhou, excluding the continents where the 9 great sects were located, the top 10 were actually the continents with the most active commercial activities. Some were regional, some were regional. Out of 3,000 continents, one commercial continent obviously couldn't satisfy the needs of cultivators. However, Red Hill could be considered as one of the top 3 commercial continents. It could be considered as a famous place. Furthermore, there were 2 spatial rifts in this place which were responsible for receiving customers coming and going in an endless stream. In the 9 continents, it was usually the Yuanying Zhenren who was in charge of the entrance and exit of the crack. They had the confidence to do so, but in Little Continent, it was usually Jean Dan who was in charge of registration. However, in Red Hill, no one was in charge of this. This was the degeneration of cultivation after commercialization reached the extreme. Everyone who came was a guest, and they were all here to deliver spirit stones. How could they use overly complicated procedures to make things difficult for guests? It was not the cultivators who maintained the safety of the commerce, but rather a common understanding. The large and small land masses in the surrounding area needed such a place to conduct transactions. Thus, all of them were maintained, and there was no need to deliberately arrange too many thugs. Of course, because of their strong financial resources, the power of the commerce was also very shocking, especially in terms of the number of Jean Dan. Most of them were rogue cultivators who worked for the commerce. However, it was not easy to hire Yuanying thugs because they went to the void of the universe. Their needs were different from the cultivators who lived in the region. The business of the Chamber of Commerce mainly depended on the target audience. For example, those major cultivators who had a small number of customers were picky and had strange needs were actually not good customers. Their target audience was still at the golden core and foundation establishment stage. There were endless potholes. Although there was no cumbersome registration, there were still a few Jean Dan guarding outside the crack, providing guidance to the guests who came from afar. They were like ushers in a supermarket, just short of wearing a belt and praising the guests on this day. The Red Hill crack teleportation portal was as crowded as usual. There were solo travelers, groups of people, and fellow disciples who were traveling together. An ordinary sunny young man walked out, smiling and greeting a few people. A few Jean Dan nodded in return, but they felt that he looked familiar. This was not strange, as many cultivators made a living in Red Hill. They frequently came and went, and it was normal for them to bring goods. Following closely 1, 2, 8, 10, dozens of cultivators walked out in a single file. They could not hide their murderous aura from head to toe, causing the ushers to panic in their hearts. 4 Jean Dan cultivators who were able to completely control their aura. There were only 2 possibilities for them to have a murderous aura. One was that they had just finished killing someone, and their murderous aura had not dissipated. The other was that they were preparing to kill someone. No matter which one it was, they did not even have the courage to go up and ask. They were strong, had a strong aura, were full of malicious intent, and had the advantage in numbers. Only a fool would go up and try to stop a chariot. One of the Jean Dan exclaimed, "I remember now. Isn't the leader the carefree travel disciple who killed the Red Earth Chamber of Commerce in the Sea of Clouds last time? Disaster." Chapter 854. More than 50 people flew in the sky, looking majestic. Among them, 6 Taoists drifted outside, while the remaining cultivators automatically formed the shape of a demon sword, slashing horizontally in the sky. In the heaven and earth chessboard, due to the restrictions placed on the cultivators by the space of the chess pieces, the demon sword formed was not perfect. It had a murderous aura, but its form was lacking. But now that they were in the real sky, there was no force that could restrict their movements. Thus, the demon sword's form was perfect, revealing a hint of coldness amidst its allure along the way. No one dared to block their path, not even one who went up to ask. They were not stupid enough to knock their heads against the blade. Tian Guan was puzzled. Is there a need to set up a formation? You don't even know who your opponent is. And even if it's a formation, why set up a foundation establishment sword formation? Song Rong said proudly, there are many sword formations, but this demon sword formation is the coolest. You don't know, but in the heaven and earth chessboard, Senior Shan led us to use this demon sword formation, 50 against 80. In the end, there were only 20 swordsmen left, and 80 ascetics and arhats were all wiped out. Don't you think the demon sword is powerful? The Taoists were silent. They did not deny it, but they did not believe it. The best way was to see it with their own eyes. Hopefully, this trip to Red Hill would give them such a chance. The small Red Hill did not have much depth. When the group approached the Red Hill Basin, the Jin Dan guards of the Chamber of Commerce had already risen into the sky to intercept them. Lu Xiaoyi's great deeds in the Red Hill Cloud Sea were only a few years ago. The people of Red Hill, or more accurately, the Red Hill Chamber of Commerce, one of the 3 largest chambers of commerce in Red Hill, still remembered it clearly. Lu Xiaoyi's description and appearance were no secret, and had been sent to all corners of Red Hill. This was why the Jin Dan guards felt that he was familiar when he appeared at the opening of the crack. But they did not react in time. They did not expect that the person who caused such a big incident in Red Hill would dare to return so casually. However, the murderous aura of the entire group still caused a few Jin Dan to react. They hurriedly sent out secret messages to buy some precious time for the Red Earth Chamber of Commerce. At this moment, the strength of the Chamber of Commerce could be seen. Not only were there guards Jin Dan, there were also the direct subordinates of the Chamber of Commerce, the shopkeepers of the various shops, the hired thugs of various parties, and some unaffiliated barbarians who did not know the truth and wanted to curry favor with the Chamber of Commerce. All in all, there were more than 300 people in the sky. They were densely packed and filled the sky. Just in terms of numbers, they were much more impressive than the 40 or so people in the demonic sword formation. A person in charge of the Chamber of Commerce stood at the front. He had a white beard and was full of vigor. Towards these invaders who had come from afar, he still maintained sufficient etiquette, the etiquette that belonged only to merchants. Even if you and I fight today, as long as you don't kill me, we can still do business in the future as long as the price is fair. Fellow Taoist Shan Air, are you here to seek justice in the Red Earth with a thunderous momentum? Since you're talking about justice, what about the death of more than 10 Redlands cultivators in the Sea of Clouds outside the Red Mountains? Before he finished speaking, the 300 or so people behind him began a clamor. Although they were not very unified, there were many of them. With hundreds of people shouting, the volume was also very loud. At least in terms of momentum, they were not inferior to the others. According to the rules of the Zhou Upper Realm, the 2 parties would have to discuss the details of what happened that day, distinguish between right and wrong, and clarify the interests involved. Perhaps there would be so-called middlemen who would come forward to mediate. Both parties would take a step back and have their own gains and losses. Even if they did not agree, they would still choose a time, place, and method to have a serious battle. Even if they relied on the chessboard of heaven and earth, it would still be a high-probability event. Tianguan, Jiedong, Tattooed Head Bull Rider, Mang Boots, Life Seed, and the other top Taoist Dharma cultivators thought so. Thousands of guests from various continents who gathered on the ground thought so too. Even the 40 or so unaffiliated swordsmen in the demonic sword formation thought so too. However, There was someone who did not think so. Lu Xiaoyi turned his head. Demonic sword? The swordsmen were stunned for a moment, then responded in unison. Demonic sword. The demonic sword was unsheathed. Under Lu Xiaoyi's lead, it rushed towards the 300 or so Jindan from the Chamber of Commerce. The demonic sword formation began to move. Lu Xiaoyi shouted, "Sword!" The swordsmen felt their blood boiling. "Sword come!" Dozens of miles away, the flying swords soared into the sky and arrived in an instant. Blood filled the sky as they rushed like wolves and boars. It was like dumplings falling from the sky. Crackling sounds could be heard as they fell. Some of them really died, while some of them could not get up due to their injuries. In any case, none of them returned to the sky. Upon closer inspection, the flying swords were actually divided into two groups. One group was the formless diffraction sword shadow. Thousands of sword lights were swift, heavy, and fast. Those who tried to block them were in a state of disarray. The other group was the materialized flying swords. More than 100 materialized swords followed behind the diffraction sword shadow and clashed left and right. Under the double attack, wherever the flying swords went, there was no one who could remain standing in the sky. The demonic sword did not go straight for the Jindan from the Chamber of Commerce. To the swordsmen, attacking from a distance was their forte. The first slash cut across the left wing of the Jindan from the Chamber of Commerce's formation. However, the flying sword were like an extended arm. Under the ravaging of the flying swords, a large piece of the Jindan was dug out. Dozens of Jindan fell to the ground. Just as the demonic sword swept across, Lu Xiaoyi shouted again, "I am Ininan." How could the swordsman not understand what he meant? My heart goes to the north. The demonic sword spun in the air and changed its position. This time, it cut towards the right wing of the Jindan from the Chamber of Commerce. The flying swords exploded again. Under the sky, only the sword lights could be seen. There was no sign of the demonic sword shadow. Under the fierce and aggressive aura, how could anyone resist such ferocity without an organized resistance? The second slash cut through the right wing. Another rain of dumplings fell. However, this time, some of the dumplings were truly dead, some were injured, and some fell to the ground on their own accord due to fear. This was unreasonable. Before the right wing was completely cut, Lu Xiaoyi shouted again, "Remove the claws and wings." The swordsmen shouted in unison, "Go straight to the root of the problem." With the two slashes of the demonic sword, more than half of the Jindan from the Chamber of Commerce had fallen to the ground. The swordsman's third slash was about to wipe them all out. However, when they turned around, the sky was clear and there was no sign of anyone. They had all run down by themselves. Only a fool would stay in the air at this time. There is only one demonic sword floating above the Red Earth Basin. Unfortunately, it was daytime. If it was nighttime, it would be even bloodier. Lu Xiaoyi slowly opened his mouth. This was the habit of the Xinyuan people. Unlike others who spoke first and acted later, the Xinyuan people prefer to act first and speak later. This saved them a lot of trouble. If they couldn't win, they would run away. If they could win, just like now, they were the master. Life and death were up to them. I came to the Red Earth Basin to meet the master behind all of you. If I can't meet him, the Red Earth Chamber of Commerce's business will cease. Chapter 855. All of the cultivators present were dazzled. Thunderous actions, ruthless killing methods, valiant and unreasonable style. Could it be that this was what a true sword cultivator was like? This included the 6 Taoists who had special status in the sect. They were able to see deeper and broader things. Tattooed Head took a deep breath. Sword Light Division. It's Sword Light Division coming out of the Naiwen. Is there such a skill in the sword vein? Shouldn't the sword disc be in the Dantian? Wan Yin Fengzi Hishidao was also very surprised. I've seen in the ancient records of my sect, it said that on the other side of the universe, there was a swordsman who hid a sword pill in the Naiwen. When he used it, he injured people. When he used it, he killed. It was one of the most vicious Taoists in the universe. Could it be this? Tian Guan sneered. Oldie, what's wrong with your eyes? Your Wan Yan's understanding of the way of the sword is still too shallow. Your eyesight is also lacking. No wonder you lost control of Shadow Shake. This isn't a sword pill. This is Zhou Xian's sword disc from the upper realm. It's just that this one ear didn't put the sword disc in his Dantian, but took the risk of putting it in his Naiwan palace, in addition to this person's sword light division reaching a higher level. That's why it gave you the feeling of a sword pill. It's actually my Zhou Xian sword disc. It's just that the method of using it is unique. I've said it before, cultivators of my generation, only by innovating can we truly walk our own path. This mass has already walked in front of us. The bull rider nodded. That's right. It's still a sword disc without a doubt. Sword light division, a foot out of the head, unfathomable. Daring to put such a dangerous sword into the Naiwan sea of consciousness, and controlling it as he pleases, amazing. Tai Xuanmong Boots sighed. It's a pity that the opponent is too weak. They can't force out this one ear's true ability. But with his skills, he was able to defeat the bitter Zen monk in the chessboard of heaven and earth. It seems like he lives up to his name. There isn't much trickery. The opponents were indeed weak. A group of 300 Jindan cultivators was much weaker than a group of 80 ascetic Arhut cultivators. There was no organization, no discipline, and no faith. How could these cultivators, who were nurtured in the field of business, compare to these lonely swordsmen who loved to fight? They had all sorts of professions, such as shopkeepers, owners, guards, hired thugs, traders. But the swordsmen only had one profession, warrior. Their loss was not unjustified at all. Against such a motley crew, even if they had 300 more, it would be useless. This was something that could not be helped. To be able to buy loyalty with money, the Chamber of Commerce was only at this level. The Red Earth Jindan, who could still stand, still did not dare to speak or make a sound. Even the white-bearded manager, Old Dan, did not know how to respond. The situation had completely gone beyond his control. His skills were inferior, and there was nothing he could do. Amidst the awkwardness, a calm voice sounded. The master behind this? Do you have the qualifications to do so? The demon blade is very interesting. Why don't you try slashing me? A figure rose from the numerous pavilions below. It was a black-faced Taoist with 3 strands of long beard. He had an immortal aura, and with a fly whisk in his hand, it was as if the heavens and earth were trembling with it. This was a Yuanying. His specific identity was unknown. Perhaps he was a friend of the Chamber of Commerce's master, or a guest. But it did not matter. Since he was willing to stand out, it meant that he wanted to pick up the grudge. Lu Xiaoyi did not answer him. He only turned his head and asked, "Want to see my swordsmanship?" The swordsmen were indescribably excited. In fact, they had already seen it in the battle just now. When the Naiwan sword was drawn from the skull, the sword light split into thousands. No matter which one it was something that they did not dare to imagine. It was as if a window had opened in front of them, allowing them to see the real world of swordsmen. In countless historical records, the position of the swordsman in the history of cultivation was unclear. Some said that the swordsman was the most powerful swordsman in the universe, while others said that the swordsman was just a minor Taoist like the body meridians. But today, at least they knew what kind of swordsman could be called a real swordsman. They were not. Yes, everyone said in unison. Lu Xiaoyi shouted, "Then watch carefully. This is my battle." He moved with his voice, and his sword disappeared without a trace. Everyone only felt that this swordsman appeared in the sky, but what came down from the sky were thousands of sword lights, rolling like dragons, majestic and mighty. The Yuanying Taoist master snorted. He had seen such powerful sword lights before. It was indeed sharp, but it was not unstoppable. He was a Yuanying, a cultivator. How could he learn the swordsman's ghost-like movements under such circumstances? A cultivator should have the style of a cultivator. Only by winning fair and square could he make up for the disadvantage in terms of momentum. Therefore, he did not move. He formed a seal with his hands and chanted an incantation. A water dragon appeared in the air in front of him. It raised its head and wagged its tail, and it went straight for the flying swords. He wanted to defeat his opponent in the area that he was most proficient in. Otherwise, it would not be enough to show that he was a cultivator. However, there are not only thousands of sword lights. Previously, Lu Xiaoyi only used a sword plate and then divided it into thousands of sword lights. It was more than enough to deal with the shrimp soldiers and crab generals. In the hundreds of years that he practiced the sword, there was never a day that he did not improve his swordsmanship. He was obsessed to the point of madness. Every once in a while, there would be a new method that would push his swordsmanship to another level. This was not just learning, but constantly creating in the midst of learning. Sword box, sword spirit, multiple sword spirits, imbalance, momentum, sword spirit bow lang po breakthrough, way sword mountain sword box, bow lang po into the box, star pill borrowing momentum, sword plate into the Niwan, sword light division, special sparrow palace taking shape. Improvement. There was never a day where it stopped. Just like now, he planned to use his strongest state in the sword light division to test the true strength of a normal Yuanying from the Zhou Xian upper realm. His current sword plate could only divide into thousands of sword lights, but the problem was that there were 5 sword plates in his Niwan palace. Therefore, the thousands of sword lights that others saw were actually the 5 sword plates that had divided into 200 sword lights. They still had the ability to continue dividing, and it was not that the thousands of sword lights from one sword plate had reached the limit of his ability. Therefore, even the Yuanying spiritual master's judgment of his sword lights was wrong. It was all because of this little trick of his. When the water dragon attacked, the 1,000 sword lights had already divided into 5,000 sword lights. The main purpose of the sword light division was not to increase the number, but to gather, fission fusion. As a result, the strength of the flying sword far exceeded that of a single sword. Under the incomprehensible gaze of the crowd, the 5,000 sword lights converged together. They gathered together to form a huge light sword. With the power of heaven and earth and the deep understanding of the concept of massacre, it fell down. In an instant, the water dragon was split into 2. Wherever the sword light pointed, a red line appeared from the top of the Yuanying cultivator's head all the way to his abdomen. Under the surging mana in his body, a mist of blood sprayed out and split into 2. Unfortunately, the 2 could no longer merge back into 1. A black hole suddenly appeared in the sky, as if there was a soul screaming unwillingly in it. Lu Xiaoyi's cold voice sounded. Next, you're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.